The first frost that bit deeper than bone. The autumn in the hamlet of Stonehaven had always been a crisp, golden affair, a time of hearty harvests and chimney smoke painting gray lines against a deepening blue sky. But this year, the bite in the air arrived not as a familiar nip but as a serpent's fang, sudden and venomous cold that settled over the valley like a suffocating shroud mere days after the last apple was plucked from old man Hemlock's gnarled trees. Elias Thorne, the village blacksmith whose forearms were thicker than most men's thighs and whose forge was the pulsing heart of Stonehaven, noticed it first not as a discomfort, but as an aberration. The water in his quenching trough, drawn fresh from the ever-flowing spring well at morning, developed a skin of ice thicker than pond scum by midday, a phenomenon unheard of before the deepest winter nights, and worse, the roaring fire in his hearth, fed with seasoned oak, seemed to struggle against an invisible weight, its heat failing to reach beyond the anvil, leaving the corners of his smithy unnaturally frigid, as if the very stones exhaled frost. Whispers slithered through the lanes faster than the creeping cold. Widow Marlowe swore she saw her breath hang in the air of her cottage like tiny, glittering daggers long before sunset, and young Tomkin, the shepherd's boy, stumbled back from the high pastures white-faced, babbling about sheep standing rigid as statues, their fleece glittering unnaturally under a sun that offered no warmth, their breath-frozen plumes hanging motionless around their muzzles. Fear, colder than the encroaching air, began to coil in the villagers' bellies. That night, under a sky unnaturally clear and filled with stars that seemed sharp enough to cut, the cold deepened with terrifying speed. Frost didn't just pattern windows, it grew in thick, feathery ferns inside the glass, crawling across kitchen tables and bedposts, and the spring well, the village's lifeblood for generations, gurgled its last, its surface freezing solid with an audible crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent night, leaving only a grotesque sculpture of trapped bubbles beneath a thick, opaque lid of ice. Dawn broke, but brought no reprieve. The sun, a pale, shrunken disk, cast no warmth, its light merely illuminating a world transformed into a ghastly still life. Trees stood encased in crystal sheaths, their autumn leaves frozen mid-fall, suspended in the air like amber insects. Birds, sparrows and robins familiar to every doorstep, lay scattered on the frozen ground, tiny feathered ice sculptures preserved in mid-hopper flight. The mill wheel by the stream was locked fast, a monstrous jeweled wheel, its wooden paddles embedded in solid ice. In the silence, it was the silence that truly stole the breath. No wind sighed, no branch creaked, no bird sang, no stream babbled. Only the dreadful, crushing silence of a world holding its frozen breath. Elias, pulling a thick bearskin tighter around his shoulders, the useless weight of his hammer hanging from his belt, stepped out of his smithy, his breath exploding in thick, white plumes that lingered far too long. He crunched across the frozen lane towards the village green, his boots leaving shallow impressions in frost that felt unnaturally hard. Others emerged, faces pale with terror and cold, their movements stiff, hesitant. They gathered, wordless, around the frozen spring well, their eyes wide with disbelief at the solid, milky ice where water had always flowed. Old Man Hemlock pointed a trembling, blue-tinged finger towards the north road, the one leading towards the distant, mist-shrouded peaks known as the Frost's Pines. "Look," he croaked, his voice thin and brittle in the stillness. Following his gaze, Elias felt a chill deeper than any cold seep into his bones. The road, the fields beyond, the distant woods, everything was not just frozen, but covered. A creeping blanket of pure, glittering white frost, thick as fresh snowfall but unnaturally smooth and dense, was advancing. It moved not with the wind, for there was none, but with a slow, deliberate inevitability, like spilled ink on parchment, swallowing the brown earth, the withered grass, the fallen leaves, turning everything it touched into a seamless, featureless expanse of blinding white ice. It wasn't snowing. The sky remained clear and cruel. This frost was growing from the ground, from the air itself, devouring the world inch by silent inch. A low moan escaped Widow Marlowe. Elias stared at the advancing wall of white, perhaps 100 yards distant now, feeling the unnatural cold radiating from it like malice made tangible. His gaze fell upon a lone, frozen sparrow lying just beyond the edge of the creeping frost. As the white tide reached it, the delicate ice sculpture didn't crack or shatter. It simply vanished, subsumed, became part of the seamless, featureless white. No trace remained. That was when the true horror struck him, colder than the deepest winter night Stonehaven had ever known. This wasn't just a freeze. This was an erasure. The world wasn't just being stilled, it was being consumed, rewritten in a single, silent, terrifying shade of frozen white. His forge, the hearth of the village, was useless against this. His strength meant nothing. Stonehaven, and everything they knew, was standing directly in the path of a devouring whiteness that left nothing behind but an eternal, silent freeze. The creeping frost line was now 50 yards away, its advance unhurried, inexorable. Elias Thorne, the strong man, felt utterly helpless. What do you do when the air itself turns against you? When the ground you stand on becomes the enemy? The answer, chillingly clear, hung in the frozen air: you freeze. Just like everything else, the silence deepened, broken only by the faint, crystalline crackle of the advancing frost, a sound like a million tiny bones breaking. It was the sound of the end, creeping closer with every stolen heartbeat. Elias gripped the cold iron of his hammer, a useless gesture against the inevitable white tide. They were trapped. Stonehaven was already a tomb waiting to be sealed in ice. Chapter 2. The Siege of the Last Hearth. The frozen silence that followed the disappearance of the sparrow was thicker than the ice sealing the springwell, a suffocating blanket woven from terror and the absolute cessation of the world's familiar sounds. Even the panicked breaths of the villagers seemed muffled, stolen by the ravenous cold before they could truly escape their lips, leaving only faint, dying plumes that hung too long in the air like spectral accusations. Elias Thorne's grip on his hammer was a futile anchor to reality, the cold iron leaching the heat from his calloused palm faster than he could generate it, a stark reminder of his utter impotence against the devouring whiteness creeping relentlessly closer, perhaps 40 yards now, its leading edge a razor-sharp line demarcating the vibrant, lost world of autumn from the sterile, advancing void. The tavern, someone shrieked, the voice raw and cracking like thin ice underfoot. It was Brenna, the miller's wife, her face a mask of frost-bitten panic beneath her shawl. The hearth, it's the biggest. Her words acted like a spark in tinder-dry kindling, the stunned immobility shattered into a desperate scramble. Bodies lurched, slipped, and stumbled on the unnaturally hard frost coating the green, a chaotic exodus towards the heavy oak door of the Stonehaven Arms, the village's only substantial building. Beyond the church, which stood exposed and vulnerable on the far side of the green, directly in the path of the white tide. Elias found himself swept along, buffeted by the surge of terrified humanity, his own instinct for survival overriding the blacksmith's ingrained stubbornness to stand his ground. He saw old man Hemlock stumble, his frail legs buckling on the slick surface, and without conscious thought, Elias hooked a massive arm around the old man's chest, hauling him forward like a sack of grain, the man's thin frame offering no resistance against the smith's desperate strength. They crashed through the tavern door just as the leading edge of the creeping frost swallowed the spot where Hemlock had fallen, the pristine white surface smoothing over instantly, erasing the scuff marks of their flight. Barring the heavy door felt like trying to hold back the tide with a broom, but Elias, Tomkin the shepherd boy, and Willem the innkeeper slammed the thick oak beam into its brackets, the thud echoing hollowly in the sudden gloom. The air inside was scarcely warmer than outside, a tomb-like chill already permeating the stone walls and heavy timbers, the lingering smells of stale ale and wood smoke now underscored by the metallic tang of encroaching ice. The large central hearth, usually a roaring beacon of warmth and community gossip, held only a sullen pile of glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe in fear rather than warmth. Willem frantically piled split logs onto the coals, but the flames that reluctantly licked upwards were thin, anemic, their heat feeble and localized, struggling against an invisible pressure that seemed to smother combustion itself. "It won't draw," Willem gasped, sweat freezing on his brow despite the chill. "The chimney, it's like the air itself is frozen solid up there." Huddled masses filled the space, perhaps 30 souls, their faces pinched and blue in the weak firelight, eyes wide with the shared, unspoken knowledge that thick walls and a struggling fire were a pathetic defense against a force that consumed the very ground and air. Children whimpered, the sound unnaturally sharp in the oppressive quiet, their breath frosting the woolen wraps pressed against their faces. Anya, the cooper's daughter, clutched a wooden doll. Elias watched, a cold dread settling deeper than any frost, as a delicate rime began to creep up the doll's painted cheek, tiny fractal patterns spreading like a disease. Outside, the silence was absolute, terrifying. No wind howled, no ice cracked, only that faint, insidious crackle, like a million tiny teeth gnawing at the foundations of the world, growing steadily louder as the white tide reached the tavern walls. It wasn't a sound heard with ears alone, it vibrated in the bones, a physical pressure against the skin. Then came the scratching, faint at first, like a mouse behind the wainscoting, but multiplied, emanating from the outer walls, the shuttered windows, the very stones beneath their feet. It was the sound of the frost growing, probing, seeking entry. "It's trying to get in," shrieked Widow Marlowe, pressing her hands over her ears, her eyes wild. "It's alive. The cold is alive." Panic threatened to boil over. A young man, Garrett, the farrier's apprentice, suddenly lunged towards the bar, grabbing a bottle of Willem's strongest rye whiskey. "Burn it," he yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Pour it on the walls. Fire drives back the cold." Before anyone could react, he wrenched the cork out and hurled the liquid towards the nearest wall. The amber stream arced through the frigid air, and froze solid before it struck the stone. A bizarre, jagged sculpture of frozen whiskey hung suspended for a heartbeat, glittering in the dim light, then shattered into 1,000 crystalline shards that tinkled like morbid bells on the flagstones. The message was horrifyingly clear: even liquid fire was powerless here. The feeble hearth flames seemed to shrink further, cowed. The scratching intensified, becoming a pervasive skittering, a sound that wormed its way into the mind. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the deepening cold and the gradual dimming of the embers as Willem's supply of dry wood dwindled. The air grew thick with the frost of their collective breath, settling on beards, eyelashes, and the rough woolen blankets they huddled under, forming a brittle, second skin. Despair, colder than the encroaching frost, settled over the room. Old Man Hemlock, propped near the failing fire, began to murmur, his voice a thin, rasping thread. The frost's pines, tales, old tales, spoke of the white silence, walks when the world sleeps, consumes the warm, leaves only the perfect cold. His words, fragmented and chilling, hung in the frozen air, feeding the terror. Then, a new sound cut through the skittering, a slow, deliberate thump. Then another, heavy, resonant, approaching the main door from outside. Thump, thump, like something massive walking on the frozen earth. Elias felt the vibration through the soles of his boots. Every eye in the tavern fixed on the barred door. The skittering frost noise seemed to pause, holding its breath. Thump, closer, right outside, silence. Then, a terrible, slow scraping, like immense claws dragging down the thick oak planks. The heavy beam securing the door groaned under an unseen pressure. Elias raised his hammer, his knuckles white, muscles coiled, though he knew it was as useful as a feather against a mountain. The scraping stopped, an unnatural stillness descended, deeper than before. Through the thick, ice-rimmed glass of the tavern's small, high window, a shape blotted out the weak, gray daylight. It wasn't clearly defined, a shifting mass of purest white, darker shadows suggesting impossible limbs, a form both massive and fluid, sculpted from the very frost that covered the world. And within that swirling whiteness, 2 points of absolute darkness appeared. Not eyes, absences, voids colder than the space between stars. They seemed to fix on the tavern window, on the huddled warmth within. No face, no features, just those twin pits of oblivion set in a form of glacial porcelain. A low moan escaped the villagers, a collective sound of primal dread. The thing outside, the frost walker, Elias's mind supplied, poisoned by Hemlock's tale, didn't move. It simply was, radiating an aura of absolute zero that seeped through the stone walls, making the struggling firelight gutter violently. The cold intensified exponentially, biting through layers of wool and hide like knives. The ale in the mugs on the tables froze solid with audible pops. The condensation on the inside of the windows thickened, crawling upwards, forming intricate, deadly lacework patterns. Then, the boy, Tompkin, near a shuttered side window, whimpered. "It's inside the wall." He pointed a trembling finger at the stonework beside him. Elias saw it, a delicate tracery of frost, impossibly complex and unnaturally fast, spreading inwards from the outer wall, not just on the surface, but through the mortar between the stones, blooming like a malignant crystalline flower on the interior tavern wall. The frost walker outside hadn't touched the door. It didn't need to. The cold was its vanguard, its weapon, its very essence, and it was permeating their last refuge. As Elias watched, frozen in horror, a single, perfect snowflake, larger than any natural one, formed in the air near Tompkin's face, untouched by the dying fire's heat. It drifted lazily, downwards, landing on the boy's outstretched finger. Where it touched, his skin instantly turned waxy white, the color draining, frost blooming outwards in intricate, rapid patterns. Tompkin screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, trying to brush it off, but his finger snapped at the joint like brittle kindling, leaving a jagged, bloodless stump that instantly glazed over with ice. The frost continued its relentless spread up his hand, his wrist, consuming flesh and bone into seamless, featureless white. The frost walker's void-like pupils seemed to deepen. The siege wasn't just at the door. It was already within. The perfect cold had found a crack. Stonehaven's last hearth was failing. Chapter 3. The Price of Warmth. Tompkins' truncated scream died in the thickening frost of the tavern air, replaced by the horrific, wet crackle of freezing tissue spreading up his arm, the sound echoing the dreadful skittering from the walls but infinitely more intimate, more wrong. His wide, terror-stricken eyes locked onto Elias for a fraction of a second, a silent plea shattering against the ice blooming across his face, silencing him forever as his features blurred into a smooth, expressionless mask of purest white, his small body collapsing inwards like a shattered ice sculpture before hitting the flagstones and shattering completely into 1,000 glittering, featureless shards that skittered across the floor, already merging with the frost creeping inward from the stonework. The horror was absolute, paralyzing. Widow Marlowe fainted, slumping silently, her own breath frosting her shawl instantly solid. Garrett, the apprentice, retched, the bile freezing in a grotesque icicle from his lips before it could reach the floor. The twin voids of the frost walker, visible through the ice-encrusted high window, seemed to drink the terror, radiating a satisfaction colder than the void between stars. The skittering intensified tenfold, a frenzied assault on the mortar, the frost on the interior walls thickening visibly, crawling across beams, snaking down the legs of upturned stools, turning the very air into a blizzard of microscopic ice daggers that stung exposed skin and stole breath. The fire, Elias roared, the sound raw and desperate, tearing itself from a throat already constricting with cold. Feed it, everything, tables, stools, the damned bar. His command shattered the stunned silence. Panic transmuted into frantic, doomed action. Men and women, their movements stiff and jerky, fell upon the tavern furniture. Willem, tears freezing on his cheeks, smashed a stool against the flagstones, the wood brittle as glass, feeding the splinters into the guttering hearth. Garrett and another man wrestled with a heavy oak table leg, their breath pluming thickly, the wood groaning in protest before snapping. They fed the chunks to the embers, which flared weakly, orange tongues licking feebly at the wood, struggling against the pervasive, soul-crushing cold radiating from the walls and the thing outside. The meager heat felt like a blasphemy against the encroaching absolute zero, a candle flickering defiantly before an avalanche. Old Man Hemlock, huddled near the pathetic flames, his lips blue, began to rasp louder, his voice a thin thread weaving through the crackling frost and the ragged breaths of the doomed. Not just cold. Hunger, the white silence hungers, for the warmth, for the life, he coughed, a spray of frozen crimson mist hanging in the air before sublimating. Old ways, forgotten pact, the heart's fire, offered willingly, his words were fragmented, fevered, lost almost in their terror, but they struck Elias like a physical blow. Hunger, offered willingly, he looked at the feeble hearth, at the villagers throwing their last scraps of wood onto it, their faces etched with despair. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The frost was inside, climbing the walls like luminous mold, creeping across the ceiling beams in intricate, deadly patterns. The temperature plummeted further. Ale mugs shattered from internal pressure as their contents froze solid. Anya's wooden doll, clutched rigidly in her frozen fingers, was now entirely encased in a rime so thick it resembled quartz. The frost walker's shadow shifted beyond the window, the twin voids unwavering. Elias felt a new kind of cold, deeper than bone marrow, settle in his gut. He understood Hemlock, or thought he did. The fire needed more than wood. It needed life. It needed fuel the cold couldn't instantly extinguish. His gaze swept the huddled forms, Widow Marlowe unconscious and frosting over, Garrett trembling uncontrollably, Willem desperately smashing another chair, Anya silently crying tears that froze instantly on her cheeks, tracing icy paths. Sacrifice. The ultimate offering against an insatiable hunger. The thought was monstrous, unthinkable. Yet, the alternative was watching them all turn into shattered ice like Tompkin, consumed utterly by the devouring white. A heavy thump resonated against the main door, stronger this time. The oak beam groaned, splintering audibly. The frost walker was growing impatient. The frost on the walls surged forward, tendrils of white snaking across the floor, reaching for the feet of those nearest the walls. A young woman screamed as the frost touched her boot, the leather instantly hardening, cracking, the cold biting into her flesh. Elias acted, not with thought, but with a blacksmith's brutal pragmatism forged in the crucible of absolute necessity. He lunged not towards the door, nor the failing fire, but towards Garrett. The apprentice saw him coming, eyes widening in confusion, then dawning horror. Elias, wah! Elias's massive fist, hardened by years of hammering steel, connected with Garrett's temple. The blow wasn't meant to kill, but to stun. It landed with a sickening crunch, amplified by the frozen air. Garrett's eyes rolled back, his body going limp. Elias caught him before he hit the frost-covered floor, heaving the unconscious man over his shoulder like a sack of grain. The tavern erupted. "What are you doing?" shrieked Brenna. "Have you gone mad?" Willem dropped the chair leg he was holding, staring aghast. Elias ignored them. The cold was in his lungs, his thoughts. Hemlock's rasping words echoed. The heart's fire, offered willingly, Garrett hadn't offered himself. This wasn't willing, it was butchery, but survival demanded butchery now. He stumbled towards the hearth, the radiating cold from the encroaching frost searing his face even as the feeble fire's heat barely registered. The frost walker outside thumped again. The main door cracked, a jagged split running down the center. The void eyes seemed to blaze with dark anticipation. Elias reached the hearth. He looked down at Garrett's slack face, pale and already frosting at the nostrils. He hesitated for a single, agonizing heartbeat, the enormity of his action crashing down. Then he saw Anya, her small form shivering violently, the frost creeping up her legs, her wide, terrified eyes fixed on him, not understanding, only knowing fear. The blacksmith's resolve, colder and harder than any iron he'd ever forged, snapped back into place. With a roar that tore his frozen throat, Elias Thorne heaved the unconscious body of Garrett the farrier's apprentice into the heart of the struggling fire. The impact scattered the glowing embers and meager flames. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The cold seemed to intensify, mocking his desperate act. Garrett's clothes smoldered, then ignited. With a sickening whoosh as the volatile oils and sweat caught. Flames, real and roaring, orange and hungry, erupted upwards, engulfing the body, greedily consuming wool, leather, flesh. The heat hit Elias like a physical blow, a shocking, almost painful wave after the pervasive freeze. It drove back the frost creeping across the flagstones near the hearth, melting it instantly into dark, steaming patches. The air itself seemed to recoil from the sudden, violent bloom of warmth. The frantic skittering in the walls ceased abruptly. The relentless creep of frost across the ceiling and walls halted, the intricate patterns seeming to tremble, arrested. Outside the high window, the immense, shifting whiteness of the frost walker flinched. Not a movement, but a recoil in its essence. The twin voids narrowed, if such a thing were possible, radiating not satisfaction now, but a sudden, profound displeasure, a rage as deep and cold as the abyss. The heat from Garrett's burning body was fierce, unnatural, fueled by fat and life extinguished. It roared defiance against the perfect cold. Willem, Brenna, the others near the hearth gasped, stumbling back from the sudden, gruesome heat, their frost-numbed skin prickling painfully. For a moment, just a moment, the crushing pressure lifted. The cold retreated a few precious feet. The crack in the door stopped widening. Elias stood silhouetted against the pyre, the heat warping the air around him, the acrid smell of burning hair and flesh filling the tavern, a horrific counterpoint to the sterile scent of frost. He had bought them time. A few minutes, perhaps. Paid for in blood and horror. The frost walker's void eyes fixed on him, pouring out an ancient, glacial hatred. The pact, broken or perverted, had been answered. The fire roared, consuming its terrible fuel. The frost waited, patient and infinite, just beyond the circle of stolen warmth. Elias knew the price was only partially paid. The hunger Hemlock spoke of had been teased, not sated. And the frost walker was still outside, watching, waiting for the flames to die. Chapter 4, Ashes in the Ancient Pact. The roaring pyre that was Garrett's body cast monstrous, leaping shadows on the smoke-blackened rafters, the intense, greasy heat a shocking, brutal assault on senses numbed by the pervasive, soul-deep cold. It drove the encroaching frost back several feet from the hearthstone, melting it into dark, steaming puddles that hissed furiously against the flagstones, and the villagers recoiled not just from the horrific stench of burning flesh and hair, but from the sheer violence of this stolen warmth, huddling just beyond its scorching reach, their faces a grotesque mask of revulsion and desperate gratitude, their frost-rimmed eyes reflecting the dancing flames that consumed the sacrifice. Elias stood closest, his face a grim mask etched by firelight and shadow, feeling the heat blister his skin even through the cold that still gnawed at his core. He didn't flinch from the sight, his blacksmith's gaze fixed on the consuming flames, seeing not the horror, but the desperate necessity, the only weapon that had made the devouring whiteness flinch. Outside the high window, the frost walker remained, a shifting monolith of glacial rage. The twin voids that served as its eyes were narrowed slits of absolute darkness, radiating a palpable fury that seemed to make the very air crackle with intensified cold beyond the fire's meager dominion, a silent promise of retribution written in the deepening frost patterns on the glass. The frantic skittering within the walls had ceased, replaced by a watchful, predatory stillness, the frost holding its frozen breath, waiting. Old Man Hemlock, barely conscious near the edge of the heat, coughed again, a spray of frozen blood crystals glittering in the firelight before vanishing. His voice, thinner than spider silk, rasped out, clinging to the edges of the roaring fire's sound. Pact, broken, he wheezed, his milky eyes unfocused, staring past Elias into the consuming flames. Not sacrifice, offering, must be given, not taken. His head lolled, a final rattling breath escaping his lips, frosting instantly into a tiny, perfect snowflake that drifted down onto his still chest. Hemlock was gone, taking the last fragments of his cryptic warning with him. Given, not taken. The words echoed in Elias's frozen mind, colder than the frost walker's gaze. He had murdered Garrett, thrown him screaming into the fire. It had worked, but only as a brutal insult, a defiance that had angered the cold, not appeased it. The true pact demanded a willing heart's fire. Willem, trembling violently, edged closer to the fire, drawn by the life-giving heat despite the horror of its source. How long? He whispered, his voice raw, eyes fixed on Garrett's blackening form beginning to collapse into embers. How long will it last? Elias didn't answer. He watched the flames, already perceptibly lower than their initial violent eruption, the fuel dwindling rapidly. The circle of melted frost was shrinking, the relentless cold pressing back inwards, reclaiming the steaming ground inch by inch. The unnatural heat was fading, and with it, their fragile shield. The frost walker sensed it too. A low, subsonic thrum vibrated through the stone floor, a sound felt in the bones rather than heard, a glacial growl of anticipation. The frost on the walls beyond the heat circle began to pulse with a faint, internal light, like captured moonlight in ice. Anya, the cooper's daughter, whimpered, clutching her frozen doll. Elias saw the frost had crept further up her legs while they were distracted, encasing her small boots entirely, the deadly white patterns now climbing her woolen stockings. He moved without thinking, grabbing her stiff, cold form and pulling her closer to the fire. The sudden warmth on her frozen skin made her scream, a sharp, agonized sound. "It burns," she cried, tears streaming down her face, freezing instantly into icy tracks. The transition from absolute cold to fierce heat was torture. Elias held her tight, his own hands numb, shielding her small body with his bulk. "Stay near the fire," he commanded, his voice gravelly. "It's the only thing holding it back." But the fire was dying. Garrett's body was mostly consumed, collapsing into a pile of glowing coals and charred bone. The intense heat diminished, becoming a fierce, concentrated glow rather than a roaring defiance. The circle of melted frost shrank faster now, the cold air rushing in to fill the void, bringing with it the scent of grave ice. The skittering sound returned, faint at first, then building, a hungry susurration from the walls, the ceiling, the very foundations. The frost walker outside shifted, its immense form pressing closer to the ice-encrusted window. The twin voids seemed to expand, drinking in the diminishing light, the growing fear. Willem threw the last broken chair leg onto the coals. It caught, flared briefly, then subsided. "There's nothing left," he cried, despair cracking his voice. "Nothing to burn." Brenna pointed a shaking finger towards the back of the tavern, towards the storeroom door. Barrels. The empty ale barrels. The shelves. It was a desperate hope. Men scrambled, their movements sluggish with cold and dread, dragging the heavy, empty oak barrels towards the hearth, smashing them apart with frantic blows. Splintered wood was piled onto the glowing embers. It caught, flaring, offering a renewed, though lesser, wave of heat. But it was wood, ordinary wood. It burned fast and hot, but without the terrible, life-fueled intensity of Garrett's sacrifice. It bought minutes, not defiance. Elias watched, holding Anya, whose shivering was less violent now, a dangerous sign of encroaching hypothermia. He looked at the faces around the fire, Willem, Brenna, the others, etched with exhaustion and terror. Given, not taken. Who among them would willingly walk into the flames? Who possessed a heart's fire strong enough to matter? His own. The thought was a physical blow. He thought of his forge, the true heart fire of Stonehaven, now extinguished under the devouring white. He thought of the strength in his arms, useless against the cold. Was that his fire, his will, his life? To throw it away, before he could grapple with the monstrous question, a new horror unfolded. Near the back wall, furthest from the hearth, where the cold pressed hardest, Widow Marlowe stirred. She hadn't moved since fainting. Now, a low moan escaped her, but it wasn't a sound of pain or fear. It was a wet, gurgling rasp. Frost wasn't just covering her, it was growing from her. Thick, crystalline structures, sharp as knives, erupted from her mouth, her nostrils, her eyes, not covering them, but replacing them, pushing outwards in jagged spikes of pure white ice. Her body convulsed, rigid, the ice spreading rapidly across her skin, thickening, encasing her in a grotesque, expanding chrysalis of frost. It wasn't being consumed from the outside like Tomkin. It was erupting from within. The white silence wasn't just outside. It was inside them, waiting. The Frost Walker's satisfaction radiated through the window like a physical wave of cold. The pact demanded a willing offering, but the cold had its own ways of claiming its due. The fire from the barrels was already faltering, the circle of warmth shrinking rapidly. Anya looked up at Elias, her eyes huge and glassy in the flickering light. "I'm cold," she whispered, her voice faint. "So cold." Elias Thorne looked from the dying fire to the child in his arms, to the monstrous ice blossom that was Widow Marlowe, and then to the twin voids watching him through the frozen glass. Hemlock's words were a curse. Given, not taken. The fire needed a heart's fire. Willingly offered, and Elias knew, with a chilling certainty that froze his own blood more deeply than any frost, that the only heart's fire strong enough, defiant enough, to possibly buy more than minutes, was his own. The Frost Walker leaned closer. The door groaned under renewed, immense pressure. The coals glowed, fading. The choice crystallized, cold and sharp as an ice dagger, piercing his soul. Chapter 5, The Fire That Walked. The choice wasn't a thought, it was a tectonic shift within Elias Thorne, a final forging in the crucible of annihilation, colder and more absolute than any quenching trough. He looked down at Anya's small, frost-rimmed face, her eyes losing focus, her breath a weak, intermittent puff of vapor, then at the dying embers that were the last barrier against the white devourer, then at the twin voids beyond the window, drinking in their despair with glacial satisfaction, and finally at the horrific ice blossom that had been Widow Marlowe, still crackling and expanding, a grotesque testament to the cold's victory from within. Given, not taken. The pact demanded a heart's fire offered freely. His forge was gone, Stonehaven was gone, but the stubborn, defiant heat that had fueled his hammer blows, that had tempered steel and shaped iron, that had hauled Hemlock to safety and thrown Garrett onto the pyre, that fire still smoldered, banked deep beneath layers of despair and cold. It was all that remained. It had to be enough. He didn't speak. Words were useless shards of ice now. With infinite gentleness belying his massive frame, Elias lowered the barely conscious Anya onto the hearthstones near the fading warmth, pressing her frozen doll into her stiffening hands. He stood tall, ignoring the gasps, the confused cries of Elias. From Willem and Brenna, he met the Frost Walker's gaze through the thickened ice of the window. The void eyes narrowed, sensing a shift, a defiance not born of desperation, but of grim acceptance. Elias stepped forward, not towards the door, not away from the cold, but directly towards the heart of the failing coals. He kicked aside the last smoldering fragments of barrel staves, scattering glowing embers across the hearthstone. He stood at the very edge, the intense, fading heat blasting his face, the cold at his back like a physical shove. He thought of molten iron, the searing brilliance, the power contained. He thought of Anya's whimper. He closed his eyes, and stepped into the embers. Not into. His heavy boot plunged into the glowing bed. Leather charred instantly, smoke curling acrid and black. Pain, white-hot and searing, shot up his leg, a shocking counterpoint to the pervasive cold. A collective gasp, choked with horror, ripped through the tavern. But Elias didn't cry out. He embraced the agony. It was fire. It was life. It was the opposite of the devouring white. He focused every shred of his being, his will, his stubborn refusal to let the cold win, into that point of contact. He offered it, not his death, but his defiance. His heart's fire. The embers reacted. Instead of merely consuming his boot, they flared with a sudden, violent incandescence, a deep, angry red that pulsed like a heartbeat. The heat surged, not outwards, but inwards, up his leg, through his frozen flesh and bone. It wasn't burning him, it was merging with him. The pain transformed, becoming a roaring furnace within his veins, a power both terrifying and exhilarating. He took another step, his other boot sinking into the coals. Another flare, brighter, hotter. The heat climbed his torso, a golden wave battling the internal ice. His thick smithy tunic smoldered, then burst into brief, fierce flames before settling into a glowing ember-like state itself, fused to his skin. Outside, the Frost Walker recoiled. Not a flinch, but a violent, jerking movement of its entire massive form away from the window. The twin voids widened, radiating shock, then a profound, ancient fury. The pervasive skittering in the walls became a shriek of protest. Elias opened his eyes. They didn't burn, they glowed. Not with reflected firelight, but with an internal, molten gold radiance that spilled out, illuminating the terrified faces around him, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like living things. His skin, where visible beneath the charred remnants of clothing, wasn't red or blistered, it was darkening, cracking like cooling lava rock, revealing glimpses of pulsing, furnace orange light beneath. Wisps of smoke, not from burning, but from the sheer intensity of his heat, curled from his shoulders, his head. He lifted his hands. The flesh was blackened, cracked like volcanic stone, the cracks bleeding light. His hammer, forgotten at his belt, glowed cherry red, then white hot, sagging, melting, dripping molten iron onto the hearthstone where it hissed and spat like furious serpents. He didn't need it anymore. He was the hammer. He was the forge. The cold pressed in, a tangible, furious wall, radiating from the Frost Walker, from the encroaching frost. It met the aura of heat radiating from Elias and recoiled. The frost patterns on the walls nearest the hearth didn't just halt, they began to retreat, melting, steaming, shrinking back towards the stonework. The ice encasing Anya's legs softened. Dripping, the deadly white patterns receding. She moaned, a sound of returning sensation, painful but alive. Elias took another step, not out of the embers, but through them, onto the tavern floor. Where his foot, now more like a burning cinder than flesh, touched the frost-rimmed flagstones, the white ice didn't melt, it vaporized with a violent hiss, leaving dark, dry stone. Steam erupted around him in great, billowing clouds. He moved towards the main door, the source of the Frost Walker's presence. Each step was a seismic event in the frozen silence. The intense heat radiating from him pushed back the cold like a physical force. Villagers scrambled backwards, shielding their faces, not from cold, but from the blistering intensity of his presence. The Frost Walker outside thundered against the door, a blow of pure, enraged cold that made the splintered oak groan and ice crystals explode from the cracks. The bar, already fractured, snapped completely. The door burst inwards, not with a crash, but with an explosion of glittering, razor-sharp ice shards. Framed in the doorway, blotting out the dead gray light, stood the Frost Walker in its full, horrifying majesty. No longer a shifting suggestion, it was a titan sculpted from glacial armor, plates of seamless, blue-white ice interlocking like some monstrous insect carapace, limbs thick as ancient tree trunks ending in claws like frozen stalactites. Its head was a smooth, featureless dome except for the twin voids, now blazing with frigid, incandescent fury. An aura of absolute zero poured from it, a wave that would have flash-frozen the tavern instantly moments before. But it met the furnace blast radiating from Elias Thorn. The collision was invisible but cataclysmic. Steam erupted in a roaring geyser where the opposing forces met, filling the doorway with a scalding, freezing fog. The Frost Walker staggered back a step, a low, subsonic groan vibrating through the earth. Elias kept walking. He reached the doorway, stepping through the swirling maelstrom of steam and conflicting temperatures. He stood on the threshold, the devouring whiteness of the frozen world before him, the terrified remnants of Stonehaven behind. He was no longer Elias Thorn, the blacksmith. He was a being of contained, walking fire, his form outlined in shimmering heat haze, his eyes molten suns fixed on the glacial titan. The Frost Walker straightened, towering over him, its void eyes burning with ancient, implacable hatred. It raised one massive, ice-clawed hand. Elias raised his own hand, fingers curled like burning talons, light bleeding from the cracks in his blackened skin. The perfect cold versus the offered fire. The siege was over. The war had just begun. Behind him, huddled in the doorway, Anya whispered through cracked, thawing lips, "Elias." Chapter 6. The Crucible of Worlds. The collision of primordial forces wasn't sound, but the absence of it, a vacuum ripped into existence between the walking forge that was Elias Thorn and the glacial titan of the Frost Walker. The air screamed as it was torn apart, molecules shattered by Elias's annihilating heat and the Frost Walker's devouring cold, creating a swirling maelstrom of superheated steam and microscopic ice shards that scoured the frozen ground between them, etching glassy patterns into the seamless white expanse. Elias stood wreathed in shimmering heat haze, his form a silhouette of cracked obsidian bleeding furnace light, molten gold eyes fixed on the twin voids of absolute negation burning within the Frostwalker's glacial helm, the intense, focused fire radiating from his core pushed back the aura of absolute zero emanating from the Titan, creating a desperate no-man's land of violent, conflicting energies where reality itself seemed to fray. The Frostwalker's ice claw, poised to strike, trembled with suppressed power, the sheer mass of frozen intent vibrating the air. Elias's burning hand, raised in defiance, pulsed with the furious, dying heartbeat of a star, the cracks in his volcanic flesh widening, shedding flakes of charred skin that turned to ash before they hit the steaming ground. Behind Elias, huddled in the shattered tavern doorway, the remnants of Stonehaven, Willem, Brenna, Anya clutching her thawing doll, shielded their faces, not just from the scalding steam and biting ice daggers, but from the sheer pressure of the opposing wills, a physical weight crushing their chests, making each breath a struggle against annihilation. Anya's whisper, Elias, was lost in the elemental roar of the conflict, but he felt it, a tiny, warm ember against the vast cold threatening to consume his soul fire. The Frostwalker struck, its claw descended not with speed, but with the inevitable, grinding force of a glacier calving into an ocean. The air froze solid in its path, creating a jagged spear of condensed cold aimed directly at Elias's blazing heart. Elias met it, his burning hand shot forward, not to block, but to grasp. Molten rock met absolute zero. The impact was cataclysmic, light, blinding, white-hot, and simultaneously dark, void black, exploded outwards. A shockwave of pure force slammed into the tavern, shaking its frost-encased stones, shattering the remaining windows into glittering dust. Villagers were thrown backwards into the gloom. Steam erupted in a geyser, instantly flash-frozen by the surrounding cold into a bizarre, jagged sculpture of ice. Where claw met hand, a terrifying equilibrium held for a suspended heartbeat. Elias's molten flesh hissed and screamed as it fought the devouring cold, blackening further, the intense light within dimming perceptibly. Rivulets of slag, the molten remnants of his very being, dripped from his wrist, solidifying instantly into grotesque, blackened tears upon the frozen earth. The Frostwalker's claw, where Elias's burning fingers gripped it, melted. Not water, but a thick, viscous fluid the color of frozen mercury dripped, sizzling and spitting as it hit the ground, releasing fumes that smelled of ancient stone and forgotten stars. The void eyes flared with rage and something else, shock, pain. The glacial titan wrenched its arm back with a roar that vibrated the earth, the damaged claw steaming, its perfect surface marred by glowing, slag-filled pits. Elias staggered, the backlash of cold through the connection like a spear of ice driven into his core. He felt his inner fire gutter, the molten light in his eyes flickering. The heat radiating from him diminished, the circle of melted frost shrinking back towards his feet. The Frostwalker recovered, its wounded limb already sheathing itself in fresh, gleaming ice. It raised both claws now, gathering the pervasive cold, drawing it from the frozen ground, the dead air, the very essence of the white silence it embodied. The temperature around it plummeted to depths unknown to mortal life, the air crystallizing into diamond dust that swirled in a vortex around its massive form. It wasn't just attacking Elias, it was weaponizing the world against him. Elias knew he couldn't win a war of attrition. The fire within him, born of sacrifice and desperate will, was finite, burning him from the inside out. The Frostwalker was the cold, eternal, endless. He needed to strike its heart, shatter its core. But where was it? The seamless glacial armor offered no weakness, no seam, only that featureless helm and the twin voids that seemed to drink the light. Anya's memory flickered in his fading consciousness, her small hand, warm against his calloused palm long ago. Warmth, life, the opposite of the void. The Frostwalker lunged, a blizzard of diamond-hard ice shards preceding it, the vortex of cold aimed to extinguish him utterly. Elias didn't dodge, he charged. He poured every remaining ounce of his heart's fire, every memory of heat, of the forge's roar, of autumn's sun on his face, of Anya's trusting gaze, into his forward rush. He became a comet, a meteorite plunging into an ice world. He slammed into the Frostwalker's chest, not with his fists, but with his entire, burning body. The impact was silent and deafening. Light and dark flared again, but this time Elias held on, wrapping his burning arms around the glacial torso, ignoring the searing agony as the absolute cold bit into his molten form, freezing layers of his being instantly, cracking and shattering even as the intense heat melted deep into the Frostwalker's icy carapace. Steam and frozen mercury fluid erupted in a chaotic fountain. He was melting it, but it was freezing him faster. His vision tunneled, the molten gold of his eyes dimming to dull ember. He felt the titanic cold seeping into his core, threatening to extinguish the last flicker of his fire. The voids in the helm loomed above him, blazing with frigid triumph. And then, through the cracking ice, the melting plates, pressed against the very center of the Frost Walker's chest where his own burning form was fused to it, Elias felt something. Not cold, not emptiness, a resonance. Deep within the glacial titan, buried beneath eons of frozen silence, was a sliver of warmth. Not heat, but an echo of it. A memory, a loss. It was infinitesimal, a single ember buried under an infinite glacier, but it was there. The heart of the cold was a frozen heart. The Frost Walker froze, not physically, but in its intent. The relentless pressure of its assault faltered. The void eyes, fixed on Elias's dimming gaze, flickered. Not with rage, but with something ancient and profoundly sorrowful. Recognition. In that frozen instant of connection, Elias understood. The white silence wasn't just hunger. It was grief, an eternal, frozen mourning for the warmth it had lost, or perhaps destroyed. The devouring cold was a monument to an absence, a void it sought to inflict upon all creation. Elias's fire was guttering, dying. But that tiny, buried resonance within the Frost Walker, it was a spark. A spark that had never gone out. Could fire ignite ice, or only consume it? The Frost Walker recovered, its glacial fury surging back, colder than before, a rejection of that fleeting vulnerability. It raised a claw to finish the smoldering remnant fused to its chest. Elias, with the last vestige of his will, his consciousness dissolving into the elemental storm, poured his dying fire not against the cold, but towards that buried sliver of resonance deep within the Frost Walker's core. A final offering, not of defiance, but of recognition. Chapter 7. The Thaw that began with a whisper. Elias Thorne, the walking forge, the vessel of stolen and offered fire, poured the last scintilla of his being, not as a weapon, but as an acknowledgement towards that infinitesimal, buried spark of resonance deep within the Frost Walker's glacial core. It wasn't a blast of heat, but the gentlest, most fragile tendril of understanding, carrying the echo of Anya's whispered name, the memory of the forge's roar, the scent of autumn leaves before the freeze, the simple, agonizing warmth of life that the white silence had spent eons mourning and eradicating. The Frost Walker's descending claw, a mountain of frozen annihilation aimed to shatter Elias's smoldering remnant, halted mid-strike. The twin voids in its helm, blazing with ancient, implacable fury, flickered. Wildly, not with rage, but with a profound, seismic shock that resonated through its entire titanic form. The vortex of diamond-hard ice shards swirling around it collapsed, falling to the frozen earth like a million shattered stars. The relentless pressure of absolute zero faltered, replaced by a terrifying stillness deeper than silence. Within the Frost Walker's chest, where Elias's molten form was fused, a sound began. Not a crack, not a hiss, but a chime. Pure, crystalline, impossibly delicate, echoing the tiny resonance Elias had touched. It grew, multiplying, a chorus of fragile bells ringing from deep within the glacial armor. Where the sound emanated, fissures appeared. Not the jagged fractures caused by Elias's heat, but fine, intricate lines like frost patterns on a winter window, spreading with impossible speed across the seamless blue-white plates. Light pulsed within the cracks, not the cold, dead light of captured stars, but a soft, golden warmth, the color of sunrise on honey. The Frost Walker shuddered, a convulsion that shook the frozen earth. A low groan escaped it, not of pain, but of release, an age-old burden fracturing. The voids in its helm softened, the absolute darkness thinning, revealing for a fleeting, impossible moment not emptiness, but the faintest suggestion of eyes, ancient, sorrowful, and profoundly human, before they were obscured by a sudden welling of thick, viscous fluid, not frozen mercury, but tears that steamed and hissed as they fell, burning tracks down the glacial face. The intricate fissures widened, the warm light intensifying, flooding outwards. With a sound like a continent sighing, the Frost Walker's massive form bloomed. Not shattered, not melted, but unfolded. Glacial plates peeled back like petals of some impossible winter rose, revealing not machinery or monstrous viscera, but a core of swirling, radiant energy, a vortex of shimmering gold and white, warmth and cold intertwined, pulsing with the chime of 1,000 tiny bells. At its very center, suspended within the light, was a figure. Not a titan, but a man, ancient beyond reckoning, his form sculpted from translucent ice that glowed with inner fire, features etched with lines of infinite sorrow and a dawning, bewildered wonder. He was clad in tattered remnants of furs that seemed woven from starlight and frost, his hair a cascade of frozen silver. His eyes, now fully open, were the color of a thawing sky, pale blue, filled with tears that steamed as they fell. Elias' thorn was gone, consumed, merged, offered utterly. Only the faintest shimmer of molten gold lingered within the swirling core light around the ancient figure, a final ember fading into the greater warmth. The radiant energy pulsed outwards in a wave. It didn't burn, it unwove. Where the wave touched the seamless, devouring white frost covering the world, the sterile perfection dissolved. Not melting into water, but retreating, shrinking back like a living thing recoiling from light, revealing the frozen earth beneath, brown, dead, but there. The wave washed over the shattered tavern. The creeping frost that had been consuming the walls from within vanished instantly. The ice encasing what remained of Widow Marlowe sublimated into wisps of steam, leaving only her peaceful, lifeless form. The unnatural cold gripping the air lessened, not becoming warm, but losing its actively hostile bite, settling into a deep, natural winter chill. The villagers huddled in the doorway gasped as the crushing pressure lifted, as feeling rushed painfully back into numb limbs, as the air, though frigid, became breathable without freezing their lungs. They watched, awestruck and terrified, as the towering glacial form of the Frost Walker dissolved, not collapsing, but dissipating like mist under a strong sun, leaving only the ancient figure standing amidst the swirling vortex of gold and white light, which itself began to dim, drawing inwards towards him. He stood on the thawed ground, barefoot on the frozen earth, looking down at his translucent hands as if seeing them for the first time. He took a shuddering breath, the first warm breath drawn in millennia, a plume of vapor that hung in the air, not freezing instantly. He looked towards the villagers, his pale blue eyes filled with an ocean of grief and a fragile, newborn confusion. He spoke, his voice not the subsonic thrum of the Frost Walker, but a thin, reedy sound, like wind through bare branches, yet carrying immense weight. It remembered, he whispered, the words hanging in the suddenly alive silence. The silence forgot. The song. He looked up at the sky, where the pale, shrunken sun now cast a perceptible, feeble warmth. The song begins again. Then, as if the effort of existence was too great, the light within him dimmed further. The ancient figure swayed. He took a single, hesitant step northward, towards the distant frost pines, then his form seemed to blur, becoming insubstantial. With a final sigh that carried the faintest echo of the crystalline chime, he dissolved into a swirl of sparkling motes, like ice crystals catching the sun, that drifted upwards on a suddenly gentle breeze, disappearing into the vast, gray sky. The light vanished, the chimes faded, the unnatural, devouring white frost was gone, rolled back as far as the eye could see, revealing the ravaged, frozen but familiar landscape of Stonehaven under a weak winter sun. The silence that remained was no longer crushing, but the deep, natural quiet of a world buried under snow and ice. It was broken by the drip 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 of melting ice from the tavern roof, the first sound of thaw. Anya, her legs freed from the frost's grip, stumbled forward out of the doorway, her doll forgotten. She looked at the spot where Elias had stood against the Titan, where the ancient figure had vanished. Only scorched, steaming earth marked the confrontation. Elias, she called, her voice small and lost in the vast quiet. Willem stepped out beside her, his arm around Brenna, both shivering violently but alive. He looked at the retreating frost line, the familiar, dead fields, the frozen but present trees. He broke it, Willem breathed, disbelief warring with dawning, fragile hope. The cold, it's just cold now. Brenna nodded, tears freezing anew on her cheeks, but these were tears of release. But Elias, she couldn't finish. Anya walked slowly towards the scorched earth. Lying there, half buried in the mud, was Elias's hammer. Not glowing, not molten, but cold iron. Ordinary. She knelt, her small fingers brushing the frozen metal. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't freezing cold either. Just iron, waiting. The drip of melting ice grew louder, a tentative percussion to the world's slow, painful awakening. The price had been paid. The fire had walked, and somewhere, in the retreating silence, a song had begun again. Chapter 8, The Song of Water and Stone. The unnatural, devouring silence was gone, replaced by the profound, aching quiet of a world deeply frozen, yet fundamentally real once more. The air still bit with a savage winter's teeth, the ground was iron-hard under layers of packed snow and ice, the trees stood as stark, skeletal sentinels encased in crystal, but the pervasive sense of being actively consumed, of the very air turning traitor, had lifted, leaving only the immense, weary stillness of a landscape locked in the deepest sleep. The villagers stumbled from the shattered husk of the Stonehaven arms, blinking in the weak, gray daylight like creatures emerging from a tomb, their breaths pluming thickly but no longer freezing instantly into glittering daggers. They huddled together, not against an intelligent malice now, but against the sheer, brutal indifference of the cold that remained, a natural adversary they understood, however grimly. Willem, his arms still around Brenna, scanned the horizon where the seamless, devouring whiteness had rolled back like a retreating tide, revealing the familiar contours of the valley, the frozen stream, the snow-draped fields, the distant, menacing peaks of the frost pines now softened by distance and veils of falling snow. "It's just winter," he murmured, the words thick with disbelief and a dawning, bone-deep exhaustion. "A hard one, but just winter." Anya didn't join the huddle. She remained kneeling on the patch of scorched, steaming earth where titanic forces had clashed and dissolved, her small fingers tracing the cold iron of Elias's hammer. It was heavy, inert, a stark contrast to the molten fury it had briefly become. No warmth radiated from it, no echo of the fire that had walked. Yet, as her skin touched the metal, a strange sensation bloomed, not heat, but an absence of the paralyzing cold that seeped from the ground into her knees. It was simply neutral, a piece of the world that refused the freeze. She picked it up, grunting with the effort, the massive head dragging in the snow. It felt like a promise. A cold promise, but a promise nonetheless. Survival became a grim, immediate calculus. The tavern was a ruin, its door shattered, walls weakened, frost having gnawed its integrity from within before being banished. The springwell remained a solid, silent tomb of ice. Every other dwelling showed signs of the frost's invasive touch, warped timbers, burst pipes imagined in the frozen silence, windows opaque with thick internal rime. The root cellar, Brenna rasped, her voice raw. Below the tavern, stone-lined, might still hold some stores. Willem nodded, the miller's practicality surfacing through the shock. "Aye, and we need shelter. This shell," he gestured at the tavern, "is better than nothing. We can block the door, shore up the weak spots." They worked in near silence, movements stiff and painful, driven by the primal urge for warmth and safety. Men dragged splintered timbers to barricade the gaping doorway. Others, led by Brenna, ventured cautiously down the ice-slick steps into the tavern's root cellar. The air below was frigid, smelling of damp earth and spoiled turnips, but miraculously, the stone walls had held. Barrels of salted pork, sacks of grain gone rock hard with frost, jars of preserves with frozen, expanded contents cracking the glass. It was meager, damaged, but it was food. Hope, fragile as an ice crystal, began to form. Days blurred into a rhythm dictated by cold and dwindling resources. They huddled in the least damaged corner of the tavern's main room, near a hearth that could only hold a small, smoky fire fueled by the wreckage of their former lives, splintered furniture, broken casks. The heat was negligible, a token defiance against the pervasive chill, but its light was a beacon against the crushing gloom. Anya rarely left the hammer's side. She kept it near her, propped against the wall, its cold iron presence a silent anchor. Sometimes, in the flickering firelight, she thought she saw faint, swirling patterns in the metal, like captured smoke, but it was likely just her tired eyes. One afternoon, while scouring the skeletal remains of the village for any usable fuel, Anya wandered near the silent springwell. The grotesque sculpture of trapped bubbles beneath the thick ice lid remained. She knelt, placing a hand on the frozen surface. It was bitterly cold. She thought of Elias, of the molten fire in his eyes, of the frost walker's glacial tears. Hesitantly, she lifted the heavy hammer. It felt different here, not warmer, but resonant. Like a plucked string humming against the silence of the well. Almost without thought, driven by an impulse she couldn't name, Anya tapped the hammer's head against the thick ice lid. Clang. The sound was sharp, clear, echoing strangely in the frozen stillness. It didn't crack the ice. But where the iron struck, a tiny, intricate web of fractures appeared, radiating outwards for a few inches, glistening with a faint internal moisture that hadn't been there before. Anya stared. She tapped again, near the first spot. Clang. Another starburst of fine cracks. And again. Clang. Each impact sent a subtle vibration through the ice, through the ground, a rhythmic counterpoint to the drip 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 of melting ice from distant eaves. Willem, hauling a splintered beam nearby, stopped and watched. Others paused in their scavenging. Anya kept tapping, methodically, moving around the well's circumference. Clang, clang, clang. The fractures spread, intersecting, deepening minutely. A low groaning sound began to emanate from deep within the frozen earth beneath the well. Anya didn't stop. She focused on the rhythm, on the feel of the hammer in her hands, on the memory of Elias shaping red-hot iron on his anvil, a different kind of song, a song of creation, not destruction. Clang, clang, clang. The ice lid shuddered. A hairline fracture snaked across its entire diameter with a sound like tearing parchment. Then, with a deep, resonant crack that echoed off the skeletal trees, the thick ice lid split cleanly down the middle. The two halves tilted, then slid with a grinding sigh into the dark shaft below, shattering on unseen rocks far down. For a moment, silence. Then, a gurgle, a wet, hesitant sound. Followed by a rush, a joyful, splashing surge of dark water, welling up from the depths, spilling over the stone lip of the spring well, steaming violently in the frigid air. It flowed, dark and life-giving, carving a path through the snow, a ribbon of liquid defiance against the frozen world. A ragged cheer went up, weak but heartfelt. Tears, warm tears this time, froze on wind-chapped cheeks. The spring well lived. Anya sank back on her heels, the heavy hammer resting across her lap, its head damp with well water spray. She looked at the flowing water, then north, towards the frost pines. The mountains seemed less menacing now, their peaks catching the weak afternoon sun in a way that almost looked like warmth. The frost walker was gone, transformed, departed on the wind. Elias was gone, his fire offered, his essence scattered. But the hammer remained, cold iron, ordinary, yet it had sung against the ice. And the water sang back. The thaw wasn't a flood, but a whisper. A drip, a song of water and stone, just beginning. Chapter 9, The Weight of the Hammer and the Whisper of Green. Spring did not roar into Stonehaven, it seeped. It arrived on the breath of a slightly less cruel wind, in the lengthening hours of watery sunlight that began, infinitesimally, to loosen winter's iron grip. The drip 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 from eaves became a constant, syncopated percussion, carving channels through the snowpack, revealing the mud and dead grass beneath, brown, sodden, but undeniably earth. The spring well's flow, once a miraculous trickle, became a steady, chuckling stream, its dark water cutting a widening path through the diminishing snow, carrying away the lingering psychic residue of the devouring white. Yet, the cold remained, a deep ache in the bones of the land and its survivors, a constant reminder of the abyss they had skirted. Rebuilding was less construction and more desperate. Salvage. The tavern, its skeleton ravaged by frost and fire, offered meager shelter. Walls were patched with scavenged timbers and packed snow, the shattered doorway covered by a heavy tapestry of layered hides, stolen from abandoned cottages whose interiors were still tombs of rime. The hearth, fed by splintered remnants of their old lives, held a small, smoky fire that fought a constant, losing battle against the pervasive chill, its light more symbolic than warming. Anya worked alongside the adults, her small frame bundled in layers of stiff, half-frozen wool. Her hands, chapped raw, hauled smaller pieces of debris, helped pack snow into gaps, carried precious armfuls of brittle, deadwood willum and the others dragged from the skeletal forest edge. But always, the hammer was near. She kept it propped by the hearth while they worked inside, its cold iron absorbing the meager heat without radiating any back. When she ventured out, she carried it, dragging its heavy head through the slush, the effort warming her muscles even as the cold bit her cheeks. It was a weight, literal and figurative, a constant reminder of the fire that had walked and the price paid. It felt like Elias's unfinished sentence. One morning, tasked with gathering the driest tinder she could find beneath the sheltering pines near the village edge, Anya paused. She leaned the hammer against a thick, frost-sheathed trunk. The silence here was different, not the crushing, sentient silence of the white silence, nor the weary quiet of the recovering village, but the deep, expectant hush of a forest holding its breath before the surge of life. Sunlight, weak but persistent, filtered through the needled canopy, catching on millions of melting ice crystals, turning the air to diamond dust. She knelt, brushing aside the crust of snow near the tree's roots, searching for dry pine needles. Her fingers touched something unexpected. Not brown needles, but a vibrant, defiant green. Tiny, spear-like shoots, impossibly delicate, pushing through the frozen earth and decaying leaf litter. Snowdrops. Their white buds, still tightly furled against the cold, nestled close to the ground, but the leaves were an emerald declaration. Anya gasped, a puff of vapor hanging in the glittering air. She touched a leaf, half expecting it to shatter like ice. It was cold, waxy, but resilient. Life, returning. Not just the grudging retreat of frost, but life actively pushing back. A wave of emotion, fierce and sudden, tightened her throat, relief, wonder, a piercing grief for Elias, who hadn't lived to see it. Without conscious thought, she reached for the hammer. Not to use it, but to show it. To share this fragile victory. Her fingers closed around the cold haft. As her skin made contact, something shifted. Not warmth, not power, but a resonance. A deep, subtle thrum vibrated up the iron, not heard, but felt in the bones of her hand. It pulsed once, low and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. At the same moment, a tiny snap sounded. One of the snowdrop buds, warmed by her breath or the focused intensity of the moment, unfurled a single, pristine white petal. The contrast was breathtaking. The delicate white flower against the frozen earth, the cold iron weight in her hand, the deep thrum echoing the silent pulse of returning life. The resonance faded as quickly as it came, leaving the hammer cold and inert once more. But the feeling lingered. The hammer wasn't Elias's fire. But it was connected, to the earth, to the deep, slow rhythms the Frost Walker's unnatural silence had tried to extinguish. It was a tool, yes. But perhaps it was also a key. A tuning fork for the song Hemlock had mumbled about, the song the ancient figure had remembered as he vanished. Anya carefully gathered a few of the driest twigs, leaving the snowdrops untouched. She picked up the hammer. It felt different, not lighter, but its weight felt purposeful now, not just burdensome. She dragged it back towards the village, the head leaving a deep furrow in the slush. As she approached the patched-up tavern, she saw Willem and Brenna examining the frozen stream near the mill wheel. The wheel remained locked fast, a monstrous jewel embedded in ice, though the edges were softening, dripping. Willem was chipping at the ice with an iron bar, his breath pluming. Still solid as stone halfway down, he grunted, frustration etched on his face. The mill won't turn without water flow. Anya walked over, the hammer heavy in her grip. She looked at the thick ice choking the stream where it should feed the wheel. She remembered the springwell, the rhythmic clang, the resonance. "Let me try," she said, her voice small but clear in the cold air. Willem paused, looking down at her, then at the massive hammer she struggled to lift properly. He hesitated, then shrugged, stepping back. "Mind your feet, lass. It's treacherous." Anya positioned herself carefully on a relatively dry rock near the stream bank. She hefted the hammer, its weight formidable. She didn't just swing wildly. She thought of the snowdrops. The deep thrum. The song of water and stone. She focused on the ice, not as an enemy to smash, but as a barrier that needed to remember its true nature. She brought the hammer down in a controlled arc. Clang. The impact jarred her arms, the sound sharp and clear, echoing off the silent mill and the skeletal trees. Where the hammer struck, a complex web of fractures spider-webbed instantly across the ice, radiating outwards several feet, deeper and more intricate than Willem's chipping had achieved. Moisture welled in the cracks. Willem's eyes widened. By the forge, Anya lifted the hammer again. Clang. Another precise strike, near the first. The fracture pattern deepened, spread, intersected. A deep groaning emanated from the ice. Clang. The third strike landed, with a sound like a giant's sigh. A whole section of ice, easily 6 feet across, fragmented and collapsed into the dark water below, swept away instantly by the current that had been pushing against it. Water surged through the new gap, swirling around the base of the frozen mill wheel. It wasn't free, but the blockage was broken. The stream had a voice again here, a gurgling, splashing song of release. Willem stared at the flowing water, then at Anya, then at the cold iron hammer in her small hands. It gleamed dully in the weak sun, water droplets beating on its surface. "How?" he breathed. Anya looked at the hammer, then north, towards the Frost Pines. The mountains seemed less like a threat now, more like a riddle. "It listens," she said simply, her breath a plume in the cold air carrying the scent of wet earth and, faintly, the promise of green. The hammer was heavy. The world was still cold. But the ice was breaking. And the song was getting louder. Chapter 10, The Greenhouse Heart. The impossible garden within the shattered tavern breathed warmth and life into the perpetual chill, a defiant emerald heart pulsing against the vast, frozen gray corpse of the world outside. The air, thick with the fecund scent of damp earth and young greenery, hung heavy and moist, condensing on the cold stone walls in rivulets that traced paths through the lingering internal frost patterns, the weak sunlight filtering through the ice-rimmed high window amplified by the reflective sheen of countless leaves, casting shifting, verdant patterns on the huddled forms of the villagers who sat, knelt, or simply stared in stunned silence, their faces slack with disbelief. There. Frost-ravaged hands hesitantly reaching out to brush the velvet softness of a bean sprout or the waxy resilience of a cabbage leaf, the sensation so alien after months of unyielding cold and deathly rime that it brought tears to eyes already raw from wind and grief. Anya lay curled on a rough pallet near the still warm hearthstones where the hammer had blazed, utterly spent, her small frame trembling not with cold but with profound exhaustion, the immense weight of the borrowed power settling into her bones like lead, her eyelids fluttering as she fought to stay conscious, watching the vibrant green world she had somehow sung into being through a haze of near collapse. The hammer itself lay beside her, inert once more, its cold iron surface dull, the faint swirling patterns she'd sometimes imagined vanished, returned to simple, unadorned metal, heavy and silent, a spent bullet after firing its miracle. Willem was the first to move beyond wonder, the miller's pragmatism surfacing through the shock. He cautiously touched the soil near a burgeoning potato plant, finding it genuinely, deeply warm several inches down, radiating a gentle heat that defied the frigid air just beyond the circle of plants, a heat that hadn't come from the meager hearth fire. It's the earth itself, he breathed, awe warring with dawning realization. The hammer, it didn't just wake the seeds. It woke the ground, made it remember summer. Brenna, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, carefully cupped a tiny, perfect strawberry blossom in her calloused palm, its white petals impossibly delicate against her scarred skin. Food, she whispered, the word thick with emotion. Real food, growing here. But the wonder was tempered swiftly by the stark reality pressing in. The vibrant green circle, perhaps 15 feet across, was an oasis of shocking vitality, yet just beyond its edge, the tavern's stone flags were still slick with meltwater from the retreating internal frost, rapidly refreezing in the pervasive chill that seeped through the patched walls and broken windows. The contrast was jarring, almost painful. The warmth radiating from the awakened soil was palpable, a balm to their frozen extremities, but it was contained, fighting a constant, invisible battle against the world's deep freeze. And Anya, she looked fragile, hollowed out. The effort had cost her dearly. Can it spread? A voice asked, hesitant. It was Jory, the wheelwright's surviving son. Can we make more? All eyes turned to Anya, then to the silent hammer. She pushed herself up weakly on one elbow, her gaze resting on the cold iron tool. She remembered the deep thrum in the forest, the resonance against the springwell ice, the connection she'd felt just before the seeds exploded into life. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingertips brushing the hammer's haft. Nothing. No thrum, no warmth, no echo of power. Just cold, heavy iron. A profound emptiness echoed within her. I don't know, she whispered, her voice cracking. It feels asleep, or empty. The hope that had bloomed with the green shoots faltered. Willem scanned the verdant patch, then the vast, frozen ruin of the tavern beyond it, then the weak light struggling through the icy window. This is a gift, he said, his voice firming. A precious one, but it's one patch. We have seeds, he gestured towards the small, precious pouch Brenna guarded, but not endless soil warmed by whatever magic Anya and the hammer did. He knelt, carefully examining the edge where the vibrant, warm soil met the cold, damp stone. This heat, it's fighting the cold, but the cold is winning at the edges. See, he pointed, the outermost seedlings, the beans reaching tendrils towards the light, showed a faint, worrying translucency in their leaves nearest the perimeter, a hint of frost nip. The circle wasn't expanding, it was under siege. We need shelter, Willem declared, standing. Proper shelter, not just patches on a ruin. We need walls that hold this warmth in, glass to trap the sun's light like a pod lid on a stew. He looked around at the shattered timbers, the collapsed sections of roof, the gaping hole where the high window was thickly glazed with ice. This place, it's dying. The cold is still in its bones. We need to build something new. Something tight. Around this, he gestured to the green heart. A house for the summer we found. The idea took root, slower than Anya's seeds but just as vital. The warmth, the smell of life, was a potent motivator, cutting through the despair that had threatened to reclaim them. Plans were sketched in the damp earth near the seedlings, using charred sticks. They would dismantle the most unstable parts of the tavern, salvage every usable timber and stone. The greenhouse, for that's what Willem called it, a word unfamiliar but instantly understood, would be small, built directly over and around the miraculously warmed earth, its walls thickly insulated with packed earth and scavenged thatch, its roof angled to catch the weak sun and, crucially, glazed. Glass, Brenna murmured, a new worry line appearing. Where do we find glass? Anya, Her strength slowly returning as she absorbed the warmth radiating from the soil, looked towards the silent hammer. It hadn't responded to her touch. But Elias hadn't always used it for fire. He'd shaped iron, fixed hinges, made nails. It was a tool. Perhaps the magic, the deep song, was spent for now. But the iron remained, strong, enduring. "We don't need glass," she said softly, her voice gaining a little strength. Everyone turned to her. "Not yet. We need skins. Clear, thin ones, stretched tight, like the bladder of the stag Willem brought back last week. Dried and scraped thin." Willem's eyes widened. "Oilskins. We can make them from the deer bladders, some of the gut, treat them." Hope flickered again, pragmatic this time. They had hides. They had fat for rendering oil. They could make translucent panels. They wouldn't be perfect, but they might trap enough light and warmth. As the villagers began to discuss the practicalities, energized by a tangible goal, Anya picked up the hammer. It was heavy, unspeakably heavy, and cold, but as she looked at the vibrant green circle, the symbol of life rested from the teeth of eternal winter, she understood its weight wasn't just iron. It was the weight of the thaw. The weight of the song Elias had started and she now had to carry, note by fragile note. She hefted it, the muscles in her thin arms protesting. It wouldn't sing the deep song of the earth again today, perhaps not for a long time. But it could still shape wood, split stone, drive nails. It could build the house for the summer they carried inside. She walked towards a pile of salvageable timbers near the edge of the green light, the hammer's head dragging slightly. The warmth from the soil faded as she stepped beyond the circle, the familiar, biting cold rushing back. She stopped, looking back at the oasis of life, then forward at the frozen task ahead. The song wasn't just about miracles. It was about the next step, the next breath, the next nail driven into wood. Gripping the cold haft tighter, Anya Thorne raised the hammer. The first blow on the frozen timber wasn't magic. It was work, but it echoed in the cold silence like the promise of a roof. Chapter 11. Northward under Elias's fireflies. The migration began not with a fanfare, but with the soft crunch of snow under worn boots, the creak of heavily laden sledges, and the low, determined murmur of voices carrying across the frozen stream. Stonehaven, or what remained of its spirit bundled in furs and determination, was moving. The greenhouse, their fragile arc of warmth and green defiance, stood behind them now, its oilskin windows gleaming faintly under a sky bruised purple and gray with the promise of deeper cold. It wasn't abandoned, it was a beacon, a testament, a promise to return. Willem had overseen the meticulous sealing of its door, thick hides lashed over timber, packed snow banked high against its walls. Inside, the earth still radiated its stolen summer heat, nurturing the slow pulse of potatoes, cabbages, and beans. It was their anchor, their guarantee against utter desolation. But the valley itself felt like a crypt. The memories of the devouring white, of Tompkins' shattering, of Garrett's pyre, and Elias's final, fiery embrace hung heavy in the thin air. The frost spines, once jagged teeth biting the northern horizon, now drew them with a strange, sorrowful gravity. The heart of the cold, Elias had called it. The source of the grief that had frozen the world. Understanding it felt less like a choice and more like the next necessary step in the thaw. Anya walked at the head of the small column, the hammer a familiar, anchoring weight across her back, secured by a harness Willem had fashioned from braided sinew. Its cold iron pressed against her spine, a constant reminder. She no longer expected it to resonate with deep earth songs or crack ice with a single touch. Its power, she understood now, was subtler, harder. It was the weight of responsibility, the persistence needed to shape a world resistant to warmth. Her gaze kept drifting north, tracing the impossible peaks. The story Willem had coaxed from the fragmented memories of the survivors painted a haunting picture. The ancient figure dissolving into sparkling motes, sighing, the silence, forgot, the song, what song? And where had the motes gone? Back to the mountains. Were they still there, glittering like frozen tears in the high crags? The journey was a gauntlet of cold and exhaustion. They followed the frozen riverbed Willem remembered from summer trading trips, its smooth, snow-covered surface easier than the drifted chaos of the open valley. Days bled into a monotony of trudging, setting up lean-tos against bitter winds, melting snow over precious, smokeless fires of dried lichen and animal fat. The hammer found its use constantly, breaking ice for water, driving stakes for shelters, cracking frozen meat. It was work, hard, unglamorous work, yet, with each swing, Anya felt a connection not to magic, but to Elias's stubbornness, his refusal to yield even when the fire seemed lost. She felt him in the ache of her shoulders, the sting of windburn on her cheeks. One night, deeper into the foothills than they had ever ventured, the cold reached a new, terrifying intensity. The air itself seemed to crystallize, stealing breath, making the stars above look like shards of broken ice. Their small fire, huddled in a ring of stones, guttered weakly, its light barely reaching their huddled forms. Despair, colder than the wind, began to seep in. Had they traded one frozen tomb for another? Was the Frost Walker's grief still too vast, too entrenched? Anya sat apart, her back against a wind-scoured boulder, the hammer lying across her lap. She stared at the dying embers, then up at the oppressive, star-filled void. The silence wasn't the devouring kind, but it was immense, crushing. Hemlock's words echoed. The song begins again. What song could possibly fight this? Not the hammer's clang, not the drip of meltwater. Something else, something lost. She closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in a desperate search for a memory. Elias's deep voice humming as he worked the bellows, the sound of Brenna singing a harvest hymn before the frost came, the chirp of a sparrow long silenced. Fragments of warmth, almost without conscious thought, a sound escaped her lips. Not a song, not even a tune. A single, pure note. High, clear, and fragile as a snowdrop bud. It hung in the frozen air, impossibly small against the vast silence. She held it, pouring her longing for warmth, her grief for Elias, her hope for the green shoots left behind, into that single, trembling sound. For a heartbeat, nothing. The cold pressed down, mocking her effort. Then, the sky moved. Above the highest peaks of the Frost's pines, where the stars seemed sharpest, a shimmer began. Not the familiar, cold dance of the auroras they'd occasionally seen, but something else. Pinpricks of light, soft green and gold, detached themselves from the firmament. Not stars falling, but rising, swirling upwards from the blackness of the mountains like luminous dust stirred from an ancient floor. They gathered, swirling, coalescing into drifting, ethereal shapes, not quite fireflies, not quite stars. They pulsed with a gentle, internal light, casting no heat, but radiating a soft, undeniable presence. They drifted downwards, not fast, but with serene purpose, weaving through the air currents above the shivering camp. Gasps rippled through the group. Willem stumbled to his feet, his face slack with awe. By the molten heart, he breathed. The luminous motes swirled lower. One drifted close to Anya, hovering near her face. It wasn't warm, but the paralyzing edge of the cold near it softened. It pulsed once, gently, a light the color of Elias's molten eyes in his final moments, then drifted on, joining the others as they danced a silent ballet over the camp. They swirled around the guttering fire, and the embers, as if encouraged, flared with renewed, almost cheerful life, casting proper light and a whisper of actual warmth. They brushed against frost-rimmed faces, and the biting sting lessened, replaced by a tingling sensation, like the promise of spring sun. The song, Brenna whispered, tears freezing anew, but these were tears of wonder. She sang, and they answered. Anya watched the luminous dance, her throat tight. They weren't Elias, but they were of him, of his fire, of the ancient figure's sorrow, of the resonance he'd touched within the Frost Walker's frozen heart. They were the thaw given form, the grief transformed, the forgotten song remembered and released. They were the fireflies of Elias's spirit, dancing in the deepest cold. The motes didn't stay. As the night wore on and the worst of the cold snap eased slightly, they gradually dimmed, their light fading like dying embers. They drifted upwards, back towards the high peaks, winking out one by one until only the familiar, cold stars remained. But the feeling they left behind was indelible. The crushing despair had lifted. The fire burned brighter. The cold, while still fierce, felt less like an enemy and more like a condition to be endured, knowing warmth, however distant, still existed. It had been a reminder, a beacon, a silent chorus answering her solitary note. Willem approached Anya as they broke camp at first gray light. He looked at the hammer on her back, then north towards the mountains, now touched with the faintest blush of dawn. They came from the peaks, he stated, his voice rough but filled with a new certainty. From the heart of it, Anya nodded, adjusting the harness. The hammer felt heavy, but no longer hopeless. That's where the song began, she said, echoing the ancient figure's final sigh. That's where we need to go. She looked back at the path they'd traveled, imagining the greenhouse far behind, holding its green secret. Then she turned her face fully towards the Frost's pines, their jagged outlines now gilded by the rising sun. The path ahead was steeper, harder, vanishing into snow and shadow. But somewhere up there, amidst the ice and rock, the fireflies of Elias's sacrifice had been born. And where they danced, perhaps the true thaw, the deep thaw of a world's frozen grief, could finally begin. She took the first step upwards, the hammer a familiar weight, the memory of green light a compass in the cold. Chapter 12, The Ice That Sang Back. The ascent into the Frost's pines was less climbing and more a brutal, relentless siege against the mountain's frozen indifference. The air grew thinner, sharper, each breath a knife point in the lungs, and the cold, no longer merely an absence of warmth but a tangible, crushing entity, seeped through layers of fur and hide with insidious persistence, numbing fingers and toes despite constant, painful movement, turning exposed skin waxy and brittle. The path Willem remembered from distant summers was buried under centuries of ice and snow, forcing them to carve their own route through treacherous drifts and across wind-scoured rock faces slick with verglas, their progress agonizingly slow, measured in yards gained for hours of exhausting effort, the heavy sledges abandoned days ago in favor of packs carried on straining backs, containing only the barest essentials, dried meat, precious lichen cakes, animal fat for fires that burned meager and smokeless in the thin air, offering scant comfort against the deepening freeze. Anya felt the hammer's weight more than ever, a constant drag on her shoulders, its cold iron a counterpoint to the burning fatigue in her legs, each step a conscious battle against the mountain's gravity and the despair whispering that they were marching into the maw of the very grief that had birthed the white silence. The luminous motes, Elias's fireflies, hadn't reappeared since that one miraculous night, leaving only the memory of their gentle light and the renewed determination they had sparked, a fragile ember guarded fiercely against the encroaching void. Days blurred into a gray-white monotony of struggle, punctuated by the rhythmic crunch of snow underfoot, the rasp of labored breathing, the constant, low moan of the wind funneling through the high passes, a sound that seemed to carry the frost walker's ancient sorrow. They saw no life, not even the hardiest lichen clinging to the highest rocks. The world here was stone and ice, locked in a perpetual, sterile slumber. Hope dwindled with each labored step, replaced by a grim, dogged persistence. Then, on the seventh day of the climb, as they traversed a narrow ledge overlooking a chasm filled with swirling, freezing mist, Willem stopped abruptly, holding up a mittened hand for silence. He pointed downwards, into the seemingly bottomless white fog. "Listen," he breathed, his voice barely audible over the wind. Anya strained, hearing only the familiar howl. But then, beneath it, woven into the fabric of the wind itself, came another sound, faint, high-pitched, almost crystalline. Not the groan of shifting ice, nor the shriek of wind over rock. It was singing, a chorus of impossibly pure, tiny voices, rising and falling in a complex, wordless harmony that resonated deep within her bones, a sound both achingly beautiful and profoundly alien. It seemed to emanate from the heart of the chasm fog. "The song," Brenna whispered, her eyes wide with awe and trepidation. "Is that it? The song he forgot?" The sound pulled at Anya, a siren call from the depths. Following it meant descending into the unknown, abandoning the precarious ledge. Willem surveyed the sheer drop, the swirling mist below. "No safe way down," he stated, the pragmatism warring with the wonder in his voice. "Not from here." Disappointment was a physical weight. They pressed on, the ethereal singing fading behind them as they climbed higher, replaced once more by the wind's mournful dirge. The memory of it, however, lingered, a haunting counterpoint to their exhaustion. The higher they climbed, the stranger the ice became. No longer just smooth sheets or jagged cornices, it began to form intricate, impossible structures, arches like frozen lace, pillars carved with spiraling patterns that defied the wind's erosion, vast walls covered in fractal designs that shimmered with internal rainbows when the weak sun touched them. It was as if the mountain itself was dreaming in ice. Late that afternoon, they reached a high plateau, a vast, windswept expanse of snow punctuated by towering ice sculptures that glowed faintly blue in the twilight. In the center of this frozen plaza stood a structure that stole their breath, not built, but grown from the ice itself. A vast, domed cathedral of crystal, its walls impossibly thin and clear, its spires reaching like frozen prayers towards the darkening sky. And from within it, amplified and purified by the crystalline structure, poured the song. Louder now, clearer, 1,000 tiny voices weaving a tapestry of sound both joyous and sorrowful, ancient and new. It filled the air, vibrating the snow under their feet, resonating in their chests. It was the sound of the ice, singing. Hesitantly, drawn by the impossible music, they approached the crystalline dome. There was no door, only a low archway formed by two flowing pillars of ice. The air within the arch felt different, still bitingly cold, but somehow less hostile, charged with the energy of the song. Anya stepped through first, the hammer heavy on her back. Inside, the world transformed. The dome wasn't empty. Its floor was a perfectly smooth sheet of black ice, like obsidian. Rising from it, covering the inner walls, flowing across the ceiling in impossible, gravity-defying streams, were formations unlike any ice they had ever seen. It pulsed with soft, internal light, blues, greens, golds, shifting and changing light-captured auroras. In this living, luminous ice was the source of the song. The intricate patterns weren't static, they were vibrating, shimmering, each tiny facet resonating at a different frequency, creating the complex, ethereal harmony. It was the mountain's heart song, the frozen grief and the buried memory of warmth given voice. At the very center of the dome, rising from the black ice floor, was a single, perfect pillar of clear ice. Suspended within it, like a fossil in amber, was a shape, not the ancient figure, but something smaller, more fundamental. A complex, swirling knot of purest light, gold and white intertwined, pulsing gently in time with the song. It radiated a profound sense of presence, recognition. This was the resonance Elias had touched within the frost walker. The buried spark, the forgotten ember, the source of the fireflies. The song swelled around them, welcoming, questioning, sorrowful. It spoke of loss so deep it had frozen the world, of a silence that had consumed even memory, and of the fragile, impossible hope sparked when fire recognized grief within the heart of ice. Anya slowly unslung the hammer, its cold iron stark against the luminous beauty surrounding her. She didn't raise it to strike. She held it before her, pointing the haft towards the pulsing light within the pillar. The song shifted, the harmonies deepening, focusing around her. The swirling light within the ice seemed to brighten, reaching out towards the cold iron. The hammer remained inert, heavy, ordinary. Yet, as Anya stood there, bathed in the ice song, holding Elias's tool, she understood. The pact wasn't broken by fire or ice. It was fulfilled by remembrance. The song wasn't forgotten anymore. The ice had sung it back. The thaw wouldn't come from smashing the pillar or wielding the hammer like a weapon. It would come from listening. From understanding the grief frozen in the mountain's heart, and answering it not with heat, but with the quiet persistence of life returning, note by fragile note, like the green shoots in a ruined tavern far below. The song continued, a lament and a lullaby for a world slowly waking from its frozen dream. Anya closed her eyes, not to block it out, but to listen deeper. The weight of the hammer was the weight of the next step, the next season, the next breath. They had found the heart of the cold. Now, they had to learn its true name. Chapter 13. The Hammer's True Forge. The song of the ice cathedral didn't end. It deepened, weaving around Anya and the inert hammer she held like an offering, the luminous patterns in the walls pulsing in time with the ancient, wordless harmonies that resonated in her bones and vibrated the cold iron in her hands. The frozen knot of light within the central pillar seemed to lean towards the hammer, not with aggression, but with a profound yearning, a desperate need for connection across the impossible gulf of frozen eons, its gold and white swirls flaring brighter as if trying to bridge the distance through sheer will. And Anya understood this was the pact Hemlock had mumbled about, the true pact Elias had blindly touched, not appeasement with fire, but communion, the warm, living world acknowledging the frozen grief at its heart. She didn't move, her own breath held, feeling the immense pressure of the mountain's sorrowful song and the hammer's stubborn, silent weight, a conduit refusing the current. Then, imperceptibly at first, the cold iron began to hum. Not the deep earth thrum she'd felt near the spring well, but a higher, finer resonance, a vibration perfectly attuned to the cathedral's crystalline chorus. It started in the haft, a subtle tremor against her palms, then spread upwards into the heavy head, the dense metal seeming to soften, not melt, but receive. The intricate, almost invisible grain within the iron itself began to shimmer, catching the shifting blues and golds of the living ice, as if the hammer was remembering it was forged from ore born deep within the earth, kin to the mountain's stony bones. The resonance intensified, a feedback loop building between tool and terrain. The song pouring from the walls seemed to focus, flowing towards the hammer, the luminous ice patterns on the ceiling swirling like liquid light drawn to a lodestone, converging above Anya, bathing her and the hammer in a concentrated beam of pure, resonant energy. The cold iron drank it in, the shimmer within its grain brightening, solidifying into visible, swirling traceries of light, silver and azure and deep earth brown, etched not on the surface, but within the very metal, as if the song was being woven into its fundamental structure. The hammer grew warm in Anya's hands, not with destructive fire, but with a deep, resonant vitality, a stored echo of the mountain's heart song. The knot of light within the pillar flared one final, brilliant time, a silent shout of release and recognition, then its pulse settled into a steady, gentle rhythm, synchronized now with the cathedral's overall harmony, no longer straining, no longer alone. The focused beam of light from the ceiling dissolved, the swirling patterns returning to their graceful dance across the dome. The song continued, unchanged in melody, yet profoundly altered in spirit, the crushing weight of ancient sorrow eased, replaced by a quieter, enduring melancholy laced with the fragile, newfound thread of connection. The hammer ceased humming, the warmth subsiding back into its core, leaving it feeling denser, heavier with purpose, yet strangely alive, the swirling internal traceries of captured light dim but unmistakable. Anya lowered it slowly, her arms trembling not from weight, but from the immensity of what had transpired. The hammer was no longer just Elias's tool, nor merely cold iron. It was a tuning fork for the world's deep song, a vessel holding a fragment of the mountain's thawing grief. Willem, Brenna, and the others stood frozen just inside the archway, their faces etched with awe bordering on terror, having witnessed the silent communion, seen the hammer drink starlight and song. The biting cold of the plateau outside pressed at the archway, but within the cathedral, the air, while still frigid, held a different quality, charged, expectant, no longer actively leeching hope. What is it now? Willem finally rasped, his eyes fixed on the hammer, its surface subtly changed. Anya hefted it, feeling the new, deep resonance within its core, a connection humming along her nerves back towards the steady pulse of light in the pillar, towards the singing walls. It remembers, she said, her voice echoing softly in the crystalline space, harmonizing faintly with the ice song. It remembers what it's for. She turned towards the archway, towards the relentless wind and the frozen path downwards. The song wasn't forgotten, it was held, and it needed to be carried back into the world, not to conquer the cold, but to remind the land of the warmth sleeping within its own bones, to encourage the thaw note by patient note. The journey down was swifter, lighter, though the cold remained as fierce as ever. Yet, something had shifted. The wind's howl seemed less mournful, more like a cleansing breath. The ice formations they passed, while still majestic and frozen, seemed less alien, less imbued with hostile silence. Anya felt the hammer's presence like a compass needle, subtly attuned to the deep currents of the earth, no longer fighting the mountain, but acknowledging it. Days later, exhausted but driven by a fragile, singing hope, they stumbled back into the valley, the patched tavern and its precious greenhouse visible as a dark smudge against the snow. As they neared, Anya felt a new pull from the hammer, a gentle resonance not towards the mountains now, but towards the earth beneath their feet, towards the greenhouse itself. She broke into a stumbling run, leaving the others behind, dragging the hammer towards the low structure. Inside, the air was thick with moisture and the fecund scent of life, the oilskins fogged, the plants, potatoes, cabbages, beans, thriving in their circle of warmth, taller, lusher, greener than when they'd left. Anya walked to the very center, where the warmed earth radiated its gentle heat. She raised the hammer, not to strike, but to hold it vertically, its head pointing downwards, its haft towards the greenhouse roof. She closed her eyes, not commanding, but listening, feeling the song within the hammer resonate with the slow, deep pulse of the awakened earth below her, with the fragile life pushing upwards. The swirling traceries within the iron pulsed faintly, visible even in the diffuse light. She felt the resonance build, a deep, silent hum passing from hammer to earth. Then, at the very edge of the green circle, where the warm soil met the still cold stone flags of the tavern floor, a tiny, impossible shoot of grass pushed through a crack in the stone, vibrant green, alive, not fed by the enchanted soil, but born from the stone itself, answering the hammer's silent, resonant call. It was a single blade, but it was life singing back. Anya lowered the hammer, tears warming her cold cheeks. The thaw wasn't a flood. It was a conversation, a song carried by cold iron and answered by stone and root. Elias's fire had broken the frost walker's grief. Now, his hammer, forged anew in the heart of the ice, would carry the mountain's song into the long silence, note by patient, resonant note, until the world remembered its own green heart. Chapter 14. The Long Work of Renewal. The single blade of grass piercing the tavern's stone floor was not a roar of victory, but a whisper of confirmation, a fragile duet between the resonating song held within the reforged hammer and the deep, slumbering memory of the earth itself. It marked the moment Stonehaven's struggle shifted from desperate survival against an unnatural freeze to the patient, arduous labor of coaxing a wounded world back towards life, a task measured not in days but in seasons, each small gain hard-won against the lingering, bitter cold that still gripped the valley like a vice but had lost its sentient, devouring malice. The hammer became the rhythm of their days, its weight a familiar anchor for Anya's growing strength, its cold iron head now itched with the faint, swirling traceries of captured mountain light that pulsed with a soft, internal warmth whenever its song resonated with the land. She used it not for miracles, but for the foundation work of renewal, splitting frost-heaved stones for rebuilding walls, driving wooden pegs into timber frames salvaged from the ruins, breaking ice on the stream so the mill wheel, freed by her earlier efforts, could turn with the strengthening flow, grinding the first precious, rock-hard kernels of frost-survived grain into coarse, life-sustaining flour. With each strike, each impact, a subtle pulse emanated from the tool, a vibration felt more in the bones of the wielder and the earth beneath than heard, a reminder to the stone, the wood, the frozen water, of the deep song sleeping within them, encouraging cooperation, easing resistance. Wood didn't magically reshape itself, but it seemed less brittle under the adze, the grain yielding with less splitting, stone fractured along cleaner lines when the hammer fell, revealing faces ready for building. Ice, while still thick, developed hairline fractures more readily under focused blows, melting faster when the weak sun touched it. It was a conversation of encouragement, not command, a nudge towards the natural state the devouring white had suppressed for so long. The greenhouse remained their vital heart, its oilskin windows glowing like a lantern in the long nights, the circle of warm earth radiating outwards inch by tortuous inch, no longer solely dependent on its initial enchantment but aided by the hammer's resonant pulses when Anya worked the soil within it, the potatoes swelling larger, the beans climbing higher, the cabbages forming tighter, greener heads. Life began to cautiously venture back into the valley. First came the hardiest birds, gray jays with raucous calls, bold enough to snatch scraps near the rebuilt hearth, their presence a startling counterpoint to the remembered silence of frozen corpses. Then tracks appeared in the fresh snow at the forest's edge, the delicate prints of hares, the heavier pad of a lone fox drawn by the scent of their meager livestock penned within the tavern's most sheltered corner. One morning, Brenna, her hands red from washing clothes in the icy stream, gave a choked cry, pointing towards the sheltered south side of the greenhouse, pushing through a thin layer of gritty snow were clusters of tiny, purple crocus blooms, their petals furled tight against the cold but undeniably vibrant, drawing strength from the residual warmth of the stones and the hammer's song vibrating through the ground. They were wild, native, unplanted. The land was remembering itself. Winters remained brutal, testing the limits of their rebuilt shelters and stored supplies, but the unnatural, world-ending depth of the freeze was gone. Snow fell, winds howled, temperatures plummeted, but spring, timid and slow, always returned, its arrival marked by the increasing chorus of returning birds and the stubborn push of green through the thawing earth, each year a little stronger, a little earlier. The connection to the frost's pines thrummed within the hammer, a constant, low hum in Anya's awareness. Sometimes, on perfectly still nights under a sky ablaze with stars sharp enough to cut, she would hold the hammer aloft, its internal traceries glowing faintly like captured moonlight, and feel an answering pulse from the distant peaks, not the sorrowful song of the ice cathedral, but a quiet, steady resonance, a shared heartbeat between mountain and valley. It was a pact maintained, a grief acknowledged but no longer all-consuming. Years layered upon years, Stonehaven, slowly, painstakingly, grew anew. Not the replica of the old village, but something sturdier, lower, built with the hard lessons of the freeze etched into every stone joint and timber brace, clustered protectively around the original greenhouse, which remained sacred ground, its central plot still radiating a perceptible warmth, tended with reverence. Children were born, their first cries echoing in the rebuilt tavern, a sound sweeter than any music, their eyes wide and unafraid of winter, knowing only the cycle of seasons as it was meant to be, challenging, but survivable. Anya, no longer a child but a woman tempered by cold and responsibility, taught them the hammer's true use. Not as a weapon, not as a wand, but as a key. She showed them how to listen for the deep song of the earth before striking stone, how to feel for the resonant point in timber, how a single, focused tap on a frozen water trough could set the ice singing into fracture lines ready for breaking. The hammer became the village's heart tool, a symbol of stewardship passed down, its weight a reminder of the long work of renewal, its faint internal light a promise of connection to the mountain that watched over them, no longer a source of dread, but a silent partner in the valley's slow, green healing. One early spring morning, The air sharp but carrying the unmistakable scent of wet earth and waking roots, Anya stood at the edge of the village, looking north. The frost pines, their peaks still capped with eternal snow, caught the rising sun, glowing pink and gold. The hammer rested lightly in her calloused hand, its song a quiet hum against her palm, resonating with the pulse of the waking land beneath her boots in the distant, answering echo from the peaks. She watched as her youngest apprentice, a girl with Brenna's bright eyes and Willem's stubborn jaw, carefully tapped the hammer's head against a large, frost-split boulder they were clearing for a new field. The girl listened, head cocked, then struck a precise point. The stone cleaved cleanly along an unseen fault line. The girl grinned, a flash of triumph in the crisp air. Anya smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. The thaw wasn't an event, it was a practice. A conversation carried on in the rhythm of the hammer's fall, the whisper of growing grass, the distant echo of a mountain's reconciled grief. The world was healing, one resonant note at a time. Chapter 15. Where the hammer laid down its song. Anya Thorne, whose hair had long since turned the color of the frostspine's highest snow and whose hands were maps of calluses written by decades of the hammer's weight, walked the path north one final time under a sky the soft, tender blue of a robin's egg. The valley behind her hummed with the deep, resonant life she had helped midwife back from the edge of eternal silence, the chatter of children born knowing only spring's return, the rhythmic clang from the rebuilt smithy where her great-grand apprentice forged nails and hinges for new homes, the lowing of cattle grazing meadows that had once been seamless white devours, the constant, contented murmur of the spring-well-fed stream turning the mill wheel that ground the valley's bounty. The unnatural freeze was a scar in memory, a tale told to wide-eyed youngsters by the hearth fire Elias's sacrifice had ultimately secured, a lesson in the fragility and fierce resilience of warmth. The hammer, resting lightly in the crook of her arm despite its enduring heft, pulsed with a slow, deep rhythm, its internal traceries of captured mountain light glowing faintly, a steady counterpoint to the vibrant song of the awakened land. It no longer needed constant guidance, its resonance woven into the valley's bones, a tuning fork harmonizing stone, root, and stream. Her steps, though slower now, were sure, following the familiar, winding trail up into the foothills, no longer a path of desperate pilgrimage but one of pilgrimage fulfilled. She felt the answering pulse from the peaks grow stronger with each rise, a quiet greeting from the heart of the reconciled cold. The journey was contemplation, not conquest. She passed the ledge where they had first heard the ice sing, the wind now carrying only the clean scent of pine and distant snow, not sorrow. She traversed the high plateau, its frozen sculptures glowing serene blue in the clear air, no longer dreaming nightmares but holding a patient, ancient stillness. The crystalline cathedral stood as before, a monument of singing ice, its entrance arch welcoming. Inside, the song remained, the same complex, wordless harmonies, but imbued now with a profound, peaceful acceptance. The luminous patterns flowed across walls and ceiling, a dance of light and cold in perfect equilibrium. The central pillar of clear ice still held the swirling knot of gold and white light, but its pulse was calm, steady, intertwined with the cathedral's song and the deep hum resonating back from the valley below through the hammer Anya carried. She walked to the center, the black ice floor smooth beneath her worn boots. She didn't raise the hammer in offering this time. She knelt, placing it gently, almost reverently, on the obsidian dark surface before the pillar. The cold iron head touched the ice. Instantly, the song deepened, enriched. The swirling light within the pillar flared gently, bathing the hammer in its radiance. The intricate traceries within the metal blazed brighter, silver, azure, and earth-brown light swirling light captured constellations. Then, slowly, the light began to flow, not out of the hammer, but into the ice. The swirling patterns etched within the iron softened, blurred, and seeped like liquid starlight from the metal, drawn into the clear pillar as if by a deep, welcoming thirst. The hammer itself didn't melt or deform, it simply surrendered its song. The captured resonance, the echo of the mountain's reconciled grief and the valley's hard-won renewal, flowed back to its source. As the last traceries faded from the iron, leaving it simple, cold, and beautifully ordinary once more, the swirling knot of light within the pillar pulsed one final, brilliant time. It expanded, not violently, but like a sigh of completion, filling the pillar entirely for a fleeting moment with pure, harmonious light that illuminated the entire cathedral, turning the singing ice into a prism of impossible color. Then it settled, calmer, deeper, its light now subtly infused with the hues that had lived within the hammer, the silver of starlight on snow, the azure of a thawing sky, the rich brown of fertile earth. The song shifted subtly, a new note woven into the ancient harmony, the quiet, persistent rhythm of life persisting, growing, remembering. Anya smiled, a network of wrinkles deepening around eyes that had seen the world freeze in flower. Her work was done. The song was whole again, held safe within the mountain's heart, enriched by the valley's long answer. The pact was complete. The hammer, its purpose fulfilled, lay silent and cold on the dark ice. Anya reached out, not to pick it up, but to rest her weathered hand upon its familiar haft one last time. It was just iron now. Good iron, strong. The iron Elias had shaped, that had held fire and fury, that had sung to stone and seed. It deserved its rest. She left it there, a simple offering on the threshold of ice and song, a testament to the long work finished. She walked back out into the clear, cold air of the plateau. The descent was peaceful, filled with the quiet satisfaction of a circle closed. She didn't look back. She knew the cathedral sang. She knew the valley lived. She knew the hammer slept where it belonged, its final note woven into the mountain's eternal melody. When she reached the valley floor, the scent of turned earth and apple blossoms greeted her. Near the path, where stone met meadow, a single, vibrant purple crocus bloomed, untouched by frost. Anya Thorne breathed deep, the air crisp but kind, filled with the song of a world that remembered how to be warm. She walked home, her hands empty, her heart full. The thaw was no longer work. It was the world breathing. Chapter 16. The field where the mountain sang. Generations bloomed like the hardy crocuses pushing through the valley's thawing edges, each spring arriving with a little more certainty, the winters fierce but finite, their bite tempered by the enduring legacy woven into the land itself. Stonehaven thrived, not as a monument to the past's terror, but as a testament to renewal, its sturdy stone houses radiating warmth from efficient hearths, its fields yielding barley golden under summers that stretched longer and warmer with each passing decade, children's laughter echoing where silence had once reigned absolute, the rebuilt mill wheel churning the springwell's faithful flow into flour that tasted of sun and resilience. The tale of the great freeze, of Elias's fire and Anya's song, became the valley's bedrock myth, recounted by elders with faces seamed like winter bark beside roaring fires, not to frighten, but to remind, of the pact with the mountain, of the long work of tending warmth, of the hammer that had sung the world back to life and now slept where its song belonged. Anya Thorne lived to see her hair whiten as the frostspine's highest snow, her hands, though still strong, finding gentler tasks than wielding the village's silent hard tool, content to watch the seeds she'd once coaxed from frozen earth become fields swaying with abundance, her greatest apprentice now the gray-haired master smith teaching youngsters the feel of good iron and the importance of listening before the hammer fell. The path north remained, worn smooth not by desperate flight but by quiet reverence. Each spring, as the first true warmth kissed the valley, a small group would make the pilgrimage, not to ask, but to acknowledge. Led first by Anya, then by her chosen successors, they would climb beyond the treeline to the high plateau where the air thinned and the world hushed, drawn to the crystalline cathedral singing its eternal, wordless hymn. They no longer entered the archway, feeling its sanctity best observed from the threshold. Instead, they gathered on the wind-scoured stone nearby, where the cold was sharp and pure, carrying no malice. And here, where Anya had placed the simple, cold iron hammer upon the black ice floor within sight of the arch generations before, something miraculous had unfolded, slow as the thaw itself. The hammer hadn't vanished, nor been encased in ice, it had simply settled. Over decades, the relentless cycle of high-altitude frost and the faint, resonant warmth still pulsing from its core, the lingering echo of its purpose fulfilled, had worked upon the stone beneath it. The dark rock had softened, flowed upwards like slow lava, embracing the hammer's base, climbing its haft in intricate, swirling patterns that mirrored the traceries of light it had once held within its iron. It wasn't buried, it was integrated. The cold iron rested now upon a natural pedestal of living stone, itself shaped into flowing, organic curves that seemed to cradle the tool. The stone around the iron shot through with veins of quartz that caught the light like captured starlight, glittering silver and faint gold. And around this anchor, life, impossibly, had taken root. Not just the hardiest lichen clinging nearby, but a vibrant, ever-expanding meadow. Lush, deep green grass, softer than any found in the valley below, carpeted the ground around the hammer stone. And within this green sea bloomed crocuses, not scattered, but in dense, breathtaking drifts. Thousands upon thousands of them, their chalices opening to the thin, clear air in shades of impossible purple, pristine white, and vibrant yellow, a riot of color against the eternal blue-white backdrop of the peaks and the serene glow of the singing ice dome. It was the field of remembering, the valley folk called it. The air here hummed, not just with the cathedral's ethereal song, but with a lower, warmer resonance rising from the earth itself, a harmony woven from stone, iron, and the defiant pulse of life blooming in the cradle of the ancient cold. The pilgrims would stand in silence, breathing air scented with cold stone and the delicate, honeyed perfume of the crocuses, feeling the dual songs vibrate in their chests, the mountain's serene, ancient melody and the earth's warm, answering thrum focused through the hammer stone. They brought no offerings but their presence, their quiet remembrance. Children, wide-eyed, would be shown the hammer, now part of the mountain's flesh, and told of the fire that walked in the song that thawed the world's grief. Elders would close their eyes, listening to the deep resonance, feeling the connection thrum through the rock beneath their boots, down the long path, back to the beating heart of Stonehaven far below. One such spring, decades after Anya had walked the path for the last time, her spirit joining the mountain's song, a young girl stood at the edge of the field, her hand resting lightly on the warm, living stone of the pedestal near the cold iron haft. She closed her eyes, not praying, but listening, as she'd been taught. She heard the high, crystalline choir from the dome, pure and timeless. She felt the deep, warm pulse rising through the stone, steady and strong. And within herself, she felt a third thing, a quiet, bright spark of her own life, her own joy in the green valley, her own small worries and hopes. It didn't drown out the other songs, it harmonized. A single, pure note, soft and clear as a bird's call at dawn, escaped her lips, blending seamlessly with the mountain's hymn and the earth's resonance. The air around the hammer stone seemed to shimmer for a fleeting second. A nearby cluster of crocuses swayed, though there was no wind. The deep hum in the stone felt warmer. The girl opened her eyes, a smile spreading across her face. She hadn't wielded a hammer. She hadn't fought the cold. She had simply added her voice to the enduring song. The pact wasn't just remembered, it was lived. The mountain sang its ancient truth. The earth resonated with hard-won warmth. And the people, standing in the field where life bloomed around cold iron and captured light, added their own verses, notes of gratitude, resilience, and the quiet, persistent joy of a world forever thawing, forever renewing, forever held in the sacred conversation between ice and fire, stone and song. The echo of her note faded into the harmonies, becoming part of the eternal music resonating from the field of remembering, down the mountainside, and into the green, beating heart of the world below. Chapter 17. The Whisper in the Warmth. The world unfurled like a crocus under a strengthening sun, seasons deepening into rhythms forgotten during the long freeze, Stonehaven's fields yielding not just survival but abundance, its sturdy stone buildings echoing with generations born knowing only the cycle of thaw and growth. The Great Freeze, a foundational myth whispered by elders whose own grandparents had known the terror of the devouring white. The pilgrimage to the field of remembering remained the valley's sacred thread to the mountains, undertaken each spring as the first true warmth kissed the lower slopes, a journey not of petition but profound gratitude, where villagers young and old stood amidst the impossible purple and gold sea of crocuses blooming around the hammer stone fused to its living pedestal, breathing air scented with cold purity and delicate honey, feeling the deep, warm resonance pulse up through the rock beneath their boots and the ancient, crystalline song pour from the ice cathedral, a harmony that vibrated in the bone and settled the soul, a reminder that warmth was not merely the absence of cold, but a hard-won conversation held in trust. Yet, even as life flourished, a subtle disquiet began to stir, not in the earth or the sky, but within the people themselves. It started with the forgetting of small courtesies, the shortening of tempers during the intense labor of harvest, the gradual neglect of the communal greenhouse's central plot, now just one fertile patch among many, its unique warmth taken for granted, the careful listening before the hammer's fall in the smithy replaced sometimes by impatient blows, the resonant connection taught by Anya's successors becoming rote technique rather than felt communion. It was a slow erosion, born of comfort and time, the fierce vigilance forged in the crucible of the freeze softening into complacency under decades of gentle sun. The songs sung at the field of remembering remained beautiful, heartfelt, but an echo of the deep, wordless knowing that had once bound singer to stone and ice seemed fainter. The resonance felt less as a physical thrum and more as a pleasant tradition. Then came the summer of the still heat. It wasn't drought, rain fell, filling the spring well-fed stream, greening the pastures. But the air hung thick and heavy, lifeless, devoid of the usual breezes that danced down from the frost's pines, carrying the faint, clean scent of distant snow. The sun beat down, not with nurturing warmth, but with a dull, oppressive weight that silenced the birdsong and made the leaves hang limp. The vibrant life of the valley seemed muted, sluggish, as if moving through syrup. Crops grew, but without their usual vigor. The mill wheel turned, but the flour it produced tasted flat, lacking the subtle vitality remembered from sunnier years. A strange lassitude settled over Stonehaven, a collective sigh of weariness beneath the unmoving sky. Alara, a great-great-granddaughter of Anya's most gifted apprentice, felt the wrongness most acutely. She worked the stone, carving intricate patterns for a new well head, her own hammer, finely made valley steel, not cold iron, feeling clumsy and unresponsive in her hands, the stone resisting her chisel with a sullen stubbornness it hadn't shown since her childhood lessons. She missed the subtle guidance, the sense of the material wanting to yield to the resonant strike. One stifling afternoon, seeking respite from the stagnant heat, she climbed the familiar path towards the treeline alone, not for pilgrimage, but for the cooler air of the heights. As she ascended, the oppressive stillness lessened slightly, replaced by the familiar, clean mountain chill. She reached the edge of the high plateau, the field of remembering spread before her, the crocuses long gone to seed, the grass deep green and lush. She approached the hammer stone, its cold iron head and quartz-veined pedestal radiating their usual, quiet solidity. She placed her palm flat on the warm stone beside it, closing her eyes, seeking the deep hum, the connection that usually steadied her. It was there, but thin, frayed, like a lute string slightly out of tune. She listened deeper, past the surface warmth of the stone, past the faint, ever-present song from the distant cathedral. And she felt it, a dissonance. Not in the mountain, not in the earth beneath the field, but downstream, vibrating back up the connection, carried on the silent resonance from the valley itself. It was the echo of their own growing indifference, their taking for granted, their quiet turning inward. The harmony wasn't broken by malice, but weakened by neglect. The resonance that flowed both ways, the mountain's ancient peace and the valley's vibrant warmth, required active participation, a conscious tending, not just passive receipt. The still heat wasn't a punishment, it was a reflection, a mirror held up to their own fading song. Alara sat by the hammer stone until the high-altitude chill seeped into her bones, the silence profound save for the eternal ice song and the faint, troubled hum beneath her hand. She thought of the impatient hammer blows in the smithy, the neglected history lessons where the tale of the freeze became mere entertainment, the greenhouse's heart patch now just another vegetable bed. The pact wasn't a spell cast long ago, it was a living conversation. And Stonehaven had started to whisper, not sing. Descending as dusk painted the peaks in rose and gold, Alara carried the weight of understanding. She didn't call a meeting, didn't preach. Instead, the next morning, she went to the old greenhouse. Ignoring the productive outer beds, she knelt in the very center, where the earth still radiated its unique, gentle warmth. She cleared away encroaching weeds, her touch reverent. She brought water from the spring well itself, not the convenient trough. And she simply sat, hands resting on the warm soil, listening. Not for magic, but for the quiet pulse of the place where Anya had sung the first green note back into the world. Others noticed. Old Man Hemlock's namesake, watching her quiet vigil, hobbled over later that day with a worn wooden trowel and began carefully aerating the soil near her. Brenna's descendant, passing by, paused and brought a handful of rich compost from the heap she'd been tending. Slowly, wordlessly, the center of the greenhouse became a focal point again. In the smithy, Alara took extra time before each strike, feeling the metal's readiness, remembering the lessons of resonance. She spoke quietly to the apprentices about more than technique, about listening for the song within the material. People began gathering again at dusk by the spring well, not just to draw water, but to listen to its chuckling song, a sound that had become background noise, now appreciated anew. The still heat didn't break dramatically, but a subtle shift occurred. A breeze, tentative at first, stirred the heavy air one evening, carrying down from the mountains the faint, clean scent of snowmelt. The leaves on the trees seemed to lift, rustling with a sound like a sigh of relief. The flour ground the next day tasted fuller. It wasn't a return to effortless harmony, but the dissonance Alara had felt at the hammer stone softened. The connection thrummed a little stronger. The warmth hadn't vanished, it had been waiting for them to remember their part in the song. The long work of renewal, Alara understood, watching fireflies dance over the newly vibrant stream at twilight, was never truly finished. It required tending, note by quiet, intentional note, lest the warmth grow still, and the silence, patient and eternal, begin its slow creep back. Chapter 18, The Frost That Bloomed in Summer. The valley breathed easier after the lifting of the still heat, the air no longer thick and suffocating but carrying the revitalizing whispers of mountain breezes once more. the leaves rustling with renewed vigor, the stream chuckling with a clearer voice, the flower regaining its subtle, sun-warmed vitality. The quiet recommitment sparked by Lara's intuition had woven its way through Stonehaven like roots, finding deeper purchase. The central plot of the greenhouse tended with deliberate reverence again, the smiths pausing to feel the resonance in metal before striking, the springwell's song listened to at dusk not just for water but for its ancient, sustaining rhythm. Yet, the true test of their remembered attentiveness came not in hardship, but in the heart of apparent abundance. On a midsummer night so perfectly warm and starlit it seemed woven from pure contentment, fireflies danced in meadows heavy with the scent of clover and ripe barley, children's laughter lingered late, and the world felt securely cradled in warmth's embrace. Dawn broke, however, under a sky of shocking, cloudless blue to reveal an impossibility: frost. Not a killing blanket, not the devouring white, but a delicate, breathtaking lacework adorning only specific places. The sacred central soil of the greenhouse glistened with intricate fractal patterns finer than any crochet, each furrow and raised clod outlined in diamond dust. The quartz veins threading the rebuilt wellhead Alara had been carving shimmered with a rime that sparkled like crushed stars, and, most astonishingly, reports came from the high pastures that the very stones marking the path towards the frost's pines bore similar, impossible frost blossoms, untouched by the surrounding dew-wet grass. Panic, sharp and cold despite the rising sun, flickered through the village. Memories of the Great Freeze, though generations old, lived in the bone-deep stories. Was the pact broken? Was the mountain's grief stirring anew? Alara, summoned to the greenhouse, pushed past the anxious murmurs and knelt by the frosted plot. She expected biting cold, the kiss of annihilation. Instead, her fingertips, brushing a frond of frost on a potato leaf, met not numbness, but a surprising, vibrant coolness, like the touch of clear spring water on a hot day, and beneath it, a hum. Not the deep earth song, nor the ice cathedral's choir, but a new frequency, intricate and crystalline, resonating directly from the frost patterns themselves. It wasn't hostile, it was articulate. Focusing, closing her eyes to the fearful whispers behind her, Alara traced the shimmering lines with her mind, feeling the vibration shift and flow. It mirrored the swirling patterns she'd seen described in the tales of the reforged hammer's internal light, echoed the fractal designs on the ice cathedral walls she knew from pilgrimage. This frost wasn't an invasion, it was a message. A reminder etched in frozen breath. The mountain wasn't reneging, it was speaking the other half of the pact. Warmth alone was not the whole song, it needed the counterpoint, the cleansing pause, the deep rest only true cold could bring. The unnatural freeze had been grief unchained, but the absence of cold's essential essence, the frost that pruned, the winter that sent roots deep, the snowpack that fed the streams, led to stagnation, the still heat's suffocating embrace. This delicate summer frost was a note in the harmony, a necessary brushstroke in the world's vibrant canvas. Understanding washed over Alara, cool and clarifying as the mountain stream. She stood, turning to the worried faces. "It's not a threat," she announced, her voice calm, carrying over the murmur. "It's a lesson. Look." She pointed not just at the frost, but at the plants beneath. The potato leaves, adorned with their icy lace, were unharmed, vibrant green. The beans showed no wilt. The frost was an adornment, a testament, not a blight. The mountain reminds us, the pact isn't just about our warmth. It's about the balance. The deep cold preserves, the frost cleanses, the winter's sleep makes the spring's awakening possible. We forgot to honor that part of the song. She organized a pilgrimage, not for the usual spring thanksgiving, but a midsummer acknowledgement. They climbed under the high summer sun, the path warm beneath their boots, the air buzzing with life, the incongruity sharp. Reaching the field of remembering, they found the hammer stone transformed. The cold iron head and the quartz-shot pedestal were sheathed in a living tapestry of frost flowers, impossibly complex, three-dimensional blooms of ice that caught the sunlight, refracting it into rainbows that danced over the crocus-green grass. The frost pulsed, not with cold, but with a light, crystalline resonance that intertwined seamlessly with the deep hum of the stone and the eternal song pouring from the cathedral. It was breathtaking, sacred. Alara approached, not kneeling in supplication, but standing tall, a partner in the dialogue. She placed her hand on a frost-wreathed curve of the pedestal. The cool vibration sang up her arm, carrying clarity, purpose. She turned to her people, their faces now filled with awe instead of fear. "We listen," she said, her voice clear in the mountain stillness, harmonizing with the frost song. "We honor the warmth, we honor the cold, we tend the green, we remember the rest." They descended carrying the mountain's icy message in their hearts. Stonehaven changed. Harvest festivals now included gratitude for the coming frost that would set next year's buds. Winter solstice became a time of deep reverence, celebrating the necessary silence, the cleansing cold, lighting candles not just against the dark, but in honor of the deep rest that nurtured the earth. They learned to store seeds relying on the natural cold's preserving touch, not just the greenhouse warmth. The smiths understood quenching not just as hardening, but as a pact between fire's heat and water's cool embrace. The unseasonal frost never returned, but its lesson lingered, woven into the fabric of their lives. The resonance Alara felt at the hammer stone grew richer, fuller, the valley's vibrant warmth now consciously harmonized with the mountain's serene cold. The song no longer just endured, but deeply understood, a conversation where gratitude flowed both ways, ensuring the thaw's renewal was not just persistent, but eternally in balance. The frost had bloomed not to kill, but to deepen the roots of the pact.